Hello and welcome back to my channel, Deku Fanfic. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off the first part of our series, What If Deku Was Suspected Traitor? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is Who Let This Guy On from fanfiction.net. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Chapter 1, Homecoming. The following is a fan-based parody. I own nothing about this property. It is owned by its respective owners. Please support the official release. Izuku Midoriya, age 21, stared at the office space in front of him. It wasn't much to look at. In fact, it was more akin to a broom closet than the other more established hero agencies he shared his building with. But the new paint job gave the room a warm atmosphere, and while the leather couch and chairs were second-hand and used, they were in excellent condition and far better than the folding chairs he was prepared to use for his sitting room before this morning. The wood floors were polished to the point where Izuku felt terrible about walking on them, and the cabinets were filled to the brim with every type of office supply he would need in the coming days. Of course, it wasn't something many people should be excited about, but damn it, he was actually looking forward to putting his pens and highlighters to good use when he needed to fill out mission reports. Because most importantly, the office and everything in it was all his. The embodiment of what he built with his own hands and years of hard work. That's what mattered the most to him. His office could have been a cardboard box on the street for all Izuku cared, as long as he could do what he needed to do. Be a hero. He sighed as he happily took a seat on the couch of his waiting area, imagining for a moment the potential clients that would come through his doors in the coming days. It was nerve-wracking, to say the least. Over 50% of hero agencies go under within the first 5 years of operation, either being bought out and absorbed into more prominent and established hero agencies or taken over directly by the Hero Commission or one of its partners. It was a rough road ahead for anyone, let alone a 21-year-old who had never officially worked for a hero agency, and someone who technically dropped out of hero school before his second year. Not to mention being back in Japan after so long. Izuku's mood darkened for a moment, the memories flooded back to him all at once. This was a long time coming to say the least, but a decision he couldn't allow himself to regret making. After all, he spent 5 years traveling the world hiding from his past, and it didn't do him any good pretending what had happened didn't actually happen. It was why he decided to move back home, after all, to try and pick up the pieces of his shattered life. A knock on the door took Izuku out of his thoughts. The commission representative had arrived earlier than expected. Izuku was just happy the office looked as decent as it did. He didn't want to start his new life on the wrong foot. So he stood, checked his appearance in the reflection of the polished window, and put on the most professional face his nerves allowed him to have. However, the professional mask he had perfected the 5 years away from home shattered when he saw exactly who was at the door. Eraserhead, Izuku said stiffly as he regarded the older man. Clearly, this was not who he expected to see today, nor was it the person he wanted to see. But if the stack of papers in the man's hands was an indication, then his former teacher was the commission representative he was set to meet. Oh, joy. The man looked similar to when Izuku saw him last, minus the addition of the prosthetic leg, of course. But he looked uncomfortable standing in front of Izuku, something the young man took some pleasure in for a moment before squashing the emotion down. Midoriya, the man gritted out, hiding half his face from view with his capture weapon. He sounded familiar, just like how Izuku remembered the man did years ago, but there was a strange hesitation to his words. It's been a while. 5 years, Izuku thought to himself. It had been 5 years since he last laid eyes on the man. 6 years since he had spoken to the man. Their last conversation never entirely left Izuku's mind in the 6 years that passed, despite Izuku's best efforts. You're an absolute disgrace, Aizawa-sensei had said to him, spitting the words like they were poison as he turned away from the boy in the prison cell. And you deserve everything that happens to you from this point on. Izuku always thought that would be the last memory he would ever have of the sleep-deprived hero. Guess he was wrong. Please come in, Izuku said politely if a little coldly as he held the door open for his former homeroom teacher. The older man stood frozen for a moment before entering the office without a word. I wasn't aware I'd be meeting with an underground hero to file paperwork. The commission still can't be worried over my loyalty, can they? The words struck the underground hero like a fist, breaking whatever calm demeanor the man had cultivated since coming back into Izuku's life. If Izuku didn't know any better, he would have assumed he had rattled the man, something Izuku would have smiled at if it had happened a few years ago. But instead, Izuku chided himself mentally. Being passive-aggressive wasn't going to help anyone, especially not now. He was home to get over his past, not wallow in it. Standard procedure, the one-legged man said as he sat down on the couch, his face returning to its ordinary emotionless mask. However, his voice still held the raw emotion that shone from his face just a moment ago. After everything that had happened these past few years, the commission made it standard for these meetings to be more hands-on to minimize potential scandals down the line. Izuku paused slightly at the word scandal but quickly recovered. It made sense. Izuku didn't like it, but it made sense. The reveal of the hero Slittengo being a high-ranking member of the Paranormal Liberation Army while an active hero had been a national embarrassment. even more so than the sudden retirement of Yoroi Musha and several other high-profile heroes at the apex of the war against the Pla. The less said about Endeavor and the myriad of his issues, the better. He shouldn't be shocked at the added scrutiny the Hero Commission was pushing to flush out potential villains and undesirable traits from their ranks. But even though Izuku knew this approach made sense, it wasn't the real reason the Hero Commission representative had to be his former homeroom teacher. The words didn't lie, at least not in a technical sense. But that didn't mean they were the whole truth. But at this point, whatever was the reason his teacher was here wasn't Izuku's business anymore. He just wanted it to be done. Izuku sat down across from his former teacher without a sound. He did his best to ignore his teacher's stare as he read through the assembled paperwork with an experienced eye. The first lesson you learn as an independent contractor in the international heroics industry is reading the fine print of government contracts. He didn't want a repeat of those 6 months in Hong Kong, so he refused to spend another day longer than he had to behind bars, being an undercover informant or otherwise. "This is a nice place," Eraser had said, his eyes scanning the simple yet comfortable-looking office. "A lot better than my first offices, at least." "Thanks," Izuku said, without lifting his eyes off a particular dense paragraph regarding the Commission's new regulations regarding team-ups between heroes of different agencies. "Can't say I was ever good with decorating." "You decorated it yourself?" the underground hero asked, confusion radiating from his voice. "Would have assumed your agency would have at least set you up with the basics before your transfer." "Oh, I don't work for an agency," Izuku said as he signed his name to a non-disclosure agreement. "The Commission put me on probation when I stepped off the plane from America." Izuku glanced up for a moment, seeing his former teacher's eyes widen in shock. Izuku watched the man for a second more, trying to remember each subtle movement of the underground hero's face. Was this him being happy that Izuku had to go through this hassle? Or was he upset that despite the roadblocks, Izuku found himself on equal footing despite his setbacks? "Yeah, it is illegal for an accredited hero agency to hire someone on probation," Izuku added, turning his attention back to the paperwork. "But, turns out though, it's not actually illegal for someone on probation to start their own agency." It was a significant loophole that hadn't been used since the beginning years of Hero Society. He had patted himself on the shoulder for literal days after discovering it. The Commission didn't seem to think so, but Izuku was starting to realize that the dislike the Hero Commission held for him was a weight he was willing to bear. An intake of breath caught Izuku's attention as he raised his eyes off the paperwork in front of him and towards his former teacher. The man was rigid as if shocked by some unknown electric quirk. His eyes were wide, and while he couldn't see the lower half of the man's face, Izuku knew the underground hero's lips had become twisted into a scowl. It was a look Izuku could never forget after all. "It's not a big deal," Izuku said, his voice betraying nothing as he spoke. "After 5 years of doing jobs no one wanted to do, it feels good being my own boss." Eraser had said nothing, but if his hands balling into tight fists against the brown leather seat was anything to go by, the man was clearly wrestling with something. But for his life, Izuku couldn't figure out what. Either that or he didn't care all too much. Izuku placed his signature on the last packet of papers, neatly packing them into the manila folders they came in. Eraser had reached his hand out silently, pausing as he looked towards Izuku before standing up from the couch. "If that's all you need me for," Izuku said as he motioned towards the door, "then I wish you a good rest of your day." Some would call him abrupt, but Izuku had a lot of things he had to do before starting his first official day as a registered hero. Dot the I's and cross the T's, as they say. He also knew that his former teacher was as uncomfortable as he was about this impromptu reunion. But, despite everything, Izuku wasn't the type of person to prolong someone's suffering if he could help it. He also didn't want to spend time with his ex-teacher any longer than he had to. The underground hero stood awkwardly, looking like a deer caught in the headlights, and for a brief moment, Izuku wondered if that was what he looked like all those years ago. But whatever internal struggle Eraserhead was dealing with was not Izuku's problem. Hero or otherwise, some things couldn't be fixed with a bright smile or an offered hand to lift someone up. "Listen, Midoriya," Eraserhead started before he seemingly gave up, the weight of his words too heavy for him to bear. He ambled to the door, his footsteps feeling more solemn and labored than those with whom he entered the office. Izuku felt a rush of relief when he finally closed the door, a polite goodnight barely leaving his lips by the time his ex-teacher left his vision. He took a calming breath and closed his eyes, falling backward into his office chair behind his desk. For a while, the only sounds Izuku could hear were traffic outside his office walls and the sound of his own heartbeat slowly but surely returning to normal. Well, Izuku said to himself that the minor panic attack was entirely under control before it overcame him. That wasn't so bad. Principal Nedzu leaned forward into his chair, leaning against his paws as he stared into the paperwork in front of him. He scanned each line after the other, memorizing every detail regarding his former charge that the papers told him. But as each detail burned into his eyes, he couldn't help but feel the frustration bristle his fur as he clenched his paws tight together. The ramble of his subordinates was not helping in the slightest. "Shoutout," President Mike said, his voice pleading as he tried vainly to calm his best friend down. "You're starting to freak me out." His friend's words did little to sway the underground hero from his action as he stared blankly out the window of Ned's office overlooking the courtyard. He hadn't said a word since he arrived back on campus, ignoring the calls and words of students and staff members as he made his way to the principal's office. He shuffled limply, like a zombie moving on nothing more than blind instinct. He hadn't even noticed the forms of his fellow teachers follow him as he tossed the packet of paperwork onto Nezu's desk. Not the best sign, Nezu thought as he looked back to the paperwork, biting back the bile that threatened to leave his throat as he saw the familiar and haunting signature on the papers. Not the best sign at all. President Mike shook his friend's shoulder, his confusion twisting into general worry as his normally stoic friend refused to acknowledge him. Snipe had gone to grab the nurse, UA's newest employee, the young healing hero White Mage, hoping the young woman could help with her healing touch. 13 and Cementos looked on in concern, their mutterings doing little to settle Nezu's growing frustration. At least Eraser had the decency to remain quiet while Nezu thought about what he needed to do. Is someone going to explain what's going on? Vlad said, crossing his massive arms against his broad chest. What happened to Eraser? Where did you send him? Nezu stared the man down, the principal's black eyes looking less human than they usually did. In times like this, Nezu's inhumanness shone brightly despite the creature's intelligence. Then, finally, the muttering stopped as if the whole room suddenly realized that whatever was happening, it was something that should be treated seriously. Midoriya, Shoutout said, his voice hollow and raw, less like a voice and more like a wounded animal trying to crawl out of his voice. Is back in Japan. All noise seemed to die in the room. For once, Nezu was allowed to think uninterruptedly. He looked back towards the commission forms the young man had signed a few hours ago, memorizing the details in front of him like his life depended on it. Why? President Mike said, his eyes widened in horror and shame as he stepped away from his friend like he had been punched in the gut. What do you mean is he okay? Midnight said, crossing the room's length in long strides as she met Shouta's eyes. The 18-plus heroine's eyes shone with emotion. Each thought she had for the boy these past few years had come to surface all at once. Where has he been? What did he say? Shouta spoke, stopping as he sucked in a breath and looked towards his friends and co-workers with a face Nezu had rarely seen on the stoic man's face. He didn't say anything. As if at once, the air in the room seemed to disappear, sucking the life out of the heroes crowding Nezu's desk. Nezu sat silently, his breathing becoming labored as he watched one of the most competent men he had ever met in his career in the middle of a nervous breakdown in front of his eyes. I sat before him for 30 minutes trying to say 2 words to him, Shouta said, trying to will control back into his body as he stared back towards the window and away from the horror-stricken faces of the room's occupants. 5 years, and I couldn't even bring myself to say I was sorry. Shouta. President Mike tried to put his hand on the Eraser hero's shoulder, but his friend shrugged it off as if physical contact caused the man pain. Then, the room's climate shifted, and each teacher except for Shouta looked toward Nezu with pleading and desperate eyes. For confirmation or for something else, the small mammal didn't know. It is exactly what Shouta said. Nezu interrupted, leaning back into his chair with a sigh as the rest of the room's occupants placed their undivided attention on the small principal. Izuku Midoriya is officially a hero registered with the Heroics Commission. His exile, as it were, has been lifted. No, it's not, Shouta said, turning to look at Nezu with a semblance of his usual tone of voice. The commission refused to lift Izuku's ban. He's still under probation until the commission believes he has shown his loyalty. Nezu felt his fur bristle as he clenched his paws together. He shouldn't be surprised at the commission's actions, but even that thought couldn't erase the disgust he felt for what was happening to the young man. He had already suffered more than anyone should, but this. It was an insult added to injury and beyond what could be considered normal. It had caused quite a stir among the hero ranks when the commission decided to levy punishments for crimes proven without a shred of doubt not to have happened. 5 years was a long time for a teenager to put his heroics career on hold. What are you talking about? Midnight asked, her eyes shining with confusion and disgust as she said the word. The commission practically threw Izuku out of the country. Nezu nodded his small head at the words. He was fearful something like this would happen whenever Izuku decided he wanted to return to Japan. But, on the other hand, he was just surprised the commission would have been so blatant. They wanted him to work for the commission, Nezu said, his eyes widening as everything began to make sense. First, the commission's punishment even after Izuku was exonerated for the crimes he was charged with. The commission refusing to authorize Izuku's transfer from UA. After his release from Tartarus, their hounding and threats against prominent international hero agencies that employed Izuku these past 5 years. This was their plan all along. It's why the commission didn't count the 5 years he was out of the country towards his probation, Shouta said with a shake of his head, his lips twisting and his jaw clenched as he spat the words out. If he didn't find that loophole, the only chance he'd get to be a hero would be as an agent under the direct control of the commission. Loophole, Midnight said, her voice broken with emotion as she looked at Nezu with a questioning look. What loophole? It seems young Midoriya has become an even greater strategist in his years away from our tutelage, Nezu said with a small smile, feeling pride in the young man's intelligence despite the situation they found themselves in. It's a law that hasn't been enforced in almost 100 years, but it allows himself the legal wiggle room to start his own hero agency without the express written consent of the commission. They can't be happy about that, Vlad said subduedly. Can't see them letting something like that go. The large man had almost been fired 5 years ago when it was discovered that several of his students had played a small role in leaking information regarding Izuku to the press. Of course, it had only been the Blood Hero's reaction to the event that had saved his position in Nezu's inner circle, but the small rodent would be lying if he said his opinion of the man hadn't changed over the whole event. The decision will, of course, be challenged in the courts, Nezu answered as he sipped a cup of tea. But until that day comes, young Midoriya will legally be a hero. As it should be, Nezu thought, his feelings about how the commission dealt with its business a well-known secret. One didn't have to look far to see the corruption in the industry after all, especially after everything that had happened these past few years. Where has he been these past few years? President Mike asked, the voice he perfected for his radio show forgotten as he looked between the broken form of his friend and the still and petrified looks of the rest of the room's occupants. What's the little listener been doing? I'm afraid all I know about the boy I've heard from Yagi-san, Nezu said, his lips quivering at the thought of his last interaction with the former #1 hero. We haven't spoken to one another for some time for obvious reasons. The room stilled again, the thoughts drifting to the events that led to all this happening. The first domino falling led them to where they all were now. The UA Traitor investigation. Does anyone else know? President Mike asked, his voice as quiet as a church mouse. Should we tell his classmates? Ex-classmates. Nezu answered, his words feeling like daggers to those who heard him. I'm sure the former class will know all about this in the coming days. Do you think? Midnight asked, her voice failing her before she could finish her question. Nezu sipped his tea, not needing the woman to finish speaking to know just what she was referring to. Would the former members of class want to try to rekindle the relationship they had ended so many years ago? Some would, those whose guilt overrides the shame they held even after so many years. Some will, I am sure. Nezu answered the unspoken question by looking at the image of Shouta's face reflecting off the window. The man's stoic mask slips with each passing moment. Nezu hadn't seen the man look like that since Yuri had demanded to know the truth about why she couldn't see Midoriya anymore. We will soon see whether their attempts will be a good thing. Hey, look, it's the consequences of my own actions. I really like suspected traitor AUs, but I actively hate a good portion of them. I usually have a list of things that I actively hate in fanfiction, and for some weird reason all of them just sort of show up in suspected traitor stories for some reason. Maybe they're all written by the same person, who knows. Unlike my previous story, The Green Man, this story isn't a glorified one-shot I just sort of slapped together because people liked it. It is an actual story that I purposely planned out from the beginning to its end. So get ready to get really sad. This will be a no-bashing zone. I try my hardest to keep characters as logically consistent as I can. And while I don't always succeed, I always make an effort, so if you've ever been turned off reading a suspected traitor story because the author has a vendetta against characters and write them like they were anime Hitler, this, my friend, is the story you need in your life. Also, unlike a lot of these types of stories, I'm not going to try to romanticize suicide. It is a story where young adults deal with guilt and trauma in a respectful and hopefully mature way that makes you really understand what each character is going through. Or it might suck, who knows. Leave a review, favorite, or follow. My poor, sensitive ego can do little when it's not supplied with the right amount of attention. Chapter 2, Katsuki. The following is a fan-based parody. I own nothing of this property. It is owned by its respective owners. Please support the official release. Katsuki Bakugo was not in the best of moods. Why wouldn't he be? For the 4th time this month, he had been on the wrong end of a bad blind date. You'd think the old hag that birthed him would have learned by now that he didn't want to be in a fucking relationship. Katsuki growled again. In his mother's infinite wisdom, she had decided that he was working too many long hours and needed to have some fun in his life, like she was some expert on the subject. Like he gave a shit about meeting new people, he already knew enough fucking people as is. He didn't need even more people he had to worry about. He walked through the busy city streets, the lights of clubs and restaurants illuminating the hustle and bustle of the late-night crowd wandering on their way to becoming properly drunk enough to start making terrible life decisions comfortably. Like the one he made when he agreed to the blind date his mom had set him up on. Of course, he did it more to shut his mom up for a few weeks than any desire to start dating, but he was willing to put some effort into the evening. He expected a pretty, if maybe a bit dull girl around his age, the type of woman his mother would call sweet because she couldn't think of anything else to describe her. She'd be starstruck and insist on taking a selfie at least once every few minutes. But, instead, he'd nod and pretend to listen to her boring hobbies and feign interest in what she did for a living. He'd cover the bill because he wasn't an animal and pretend to get called in for a villain incident on the other side of town. Then, of course, he'd never see her again but insisted he had an okay time whenever someone brought it up. The date of the evening, however, was fucking Satan incarnate. She was one of the models from his mother's agency. He'd been told a real firecracker, someone who reminded his mom a lot of him growing up. It was true, mainly because Katsuki hated who he was when he was growing up. To the surprise of no one, the whole situation had been a shit show. All she did was talk, 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 and yet Katsuki couldn't think of a single word that left the woman's mouth, and he tried to. Katsuki was just going to do what he usually did, if a little quicker than he usually did. But she had to keep getting worse. Who the hell starts berating their waitress over a bottle of wine the restaurant didn't have in stock? Like it was the waitress's fault his date couldn't get the exact 100,000 yen bottle of overpriced alcohol. The nervous young woman, who looked to be near tears by the time his date had started getting loud, was trying her best to do her job. And stop with that creepy muttering, the woman had shouted, fully aware of the scene she was creating. Maybe if you were halfway competent with your job, you wouldn't have to write every word down to remember the exact bottle I ordered. He could see the tabloid magazines now. 15 Panga Hero Ground Zero publicly berates model girlfriend in drunken argument. Even though he wasn't the one who started it, it was his date who had gotten them thrown out, who treated a waitress like that for stuttering. So what if she needed a way to help remember complicated orders? She wasn't hurting anyone, was she? Katsuki sighed at the thought. Despite the shitshow his evening had become, Katsuki couldn't blame his mother for worrying about him. It wasn't like he was opposed to meeting someone. It was just, she laughed at his joke while trying to clean the ice cream that dripped onto her pink blouse. He didn't think it was a good joke, but hearing her laugh made Katsuki feel like he was on top of a mountain with the wind brushing his hair. She was still smiling as she looked at him with her big brown eyes, and all Katsuki could think about was just how soft and cute her lips looked to him. Katsuki reached down and pushed a brown curl out of her eyes, the girl's usually pink cheeks burning scarlet as she watched him lean down to her and capture her lips. Bakugo stopped dead in his tracks as the memories rushed back. He bit his lip to stop the sound from escaping his mouth because he knew it would sound like a sob. That was the last time he ever remembered feeling happy before the world he had built around him for more than 17 years crashed around him like a house of cards. Has it been 5 years since the last time Katsuki felt happy? But, of course, it feels way longer than that, doesn't it? The last morning he woke up inside his bed without feeling like a complete and utter piece of shit. The last morning he wore his hero costume without being reminded of the horrible things he had done in his life. 5 years since she broke up with him. The brown-haired girl stopped as she looked away from him. Her big brown eyes were already crying as her body was racked again by another sob. Why was this happening? I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. It's about Deku, isn't it? He said. His voice was quiet and broken as the words felt like they evaporated by a sun that felt way too hot. Why was this happening? The day had started out so lovely. Not a cloud in the sky, and everything felt like it was going Katsuki's way. How could a few short hours change so much? Deku, Katsuki spat, the name sounding like needles as it left his throat. It doesn't change us, but it does. The girl looked at him, her eyes feeling like hunks of amber as she stood before him, dried tear marks down her face. It really does. Excuse me, sir. A voice broke Katsuki out of his thoughts, the pro-hero stunned by just how far he had walked while he was stuck in the past. This is a crime scene. Sure enough, the voice was right. Katsuki didn't notice the squad car's flashing lights nor the ambulance outside in the street. Dozens of onlookers stopped the night revelry as they watched the emergency workers do their work. The colored light of the neon lights of restaurants and clubs gave the scene an unreal quality, like it was a crime-themed section of an amusement park. How long had he been walking? Katsuki turned to stare at the police officer that spoke to him, seeing an unfamiliar face staring back at him. But, of course, a rookie would be the one to stop him. The one guy on the scene who would overlook a pro-fucking hero when he saw one. Relax, kid, Bakugo said, his voice like a growl of a wolf who hadn't quite decided if the rabbit in his vision was worth the hunt as he pulled his hero ID out of his pocket. I'm a hero. Oh, Mr. Ground Zero, sir. The rookie shot to attention, the freckles on his face burning his face in a scarlet blush. The green hair on his head made the young officer look like a living strawberry. I'm so sorry to bother you. I didn't recognize you. Katsuki ignored the younger man as he walked past him and towards the shattered glass that once belonged to one of those high-class hostess bars that had opened up in the area. Workers and patrons alike flooded the entranceway, some speaking to police. In contrast, others met with paramedics to deal with minor injuries. Still, most just watched as the chaos spilled over into the streets, like an audience watching a circus. Speaking of a circus, Katsuki said as he noticed that the media had already started to make their appearance on the scene, trying to find anyone who would speak to them about what had happened. Maybe Sparkles really was the smart one of their class, after all. Dropping out of the hero course beginning of their third year was a shock at first, but at least he doesn't have to deal with news reporters running his support company. He could pay people to do that shit for him. Well, if it isn't Ground Zero, the aging detective said as he got off the police radio. It was a familiar face, at least one of the few cops in Katsuki's district that the explosion user actually got along with, if barely. I thought you had the night off. I'm here now. Katsuki spat, not wanting to be reminded of the garbage fire his love life had become what seems to be the issue here. Attempted kidnapping, the old detective said, pointing towards a young woman with green skin and purple hair cut short. Never a dull moment these days, huh? Katsuki stared at the woman for a moment, noticing the bandages on her hand and head were a different color and brand than the ones used by the paramedics. This meant that whoever the hero was on the scene had prepared for and was at least somewhat familiar with first aid. There weren't many non-rescue heroes who prepared far ahead to interact with victims, especially underground heroes who operated at night, preferring the more hit-quick and get-out-even-quicker approach to confrontations. To see someone who bucked the trend in such a way was interesting, to say the least. You don't say, Katsuki growled as he surveyed a group of uniformed police helping two paramedics lift a huge man into one of the awaiting squad vans. The man's rock-like body doing little to help the emergency workers' plight. Yeah, the big guy with two accomplices tried to strong-arm one of the workers here to come and party with them, the old man said as he took out a pack of cigarettes. She refused, and things started to get a little messy. A place this fancy doesn't have security, Katsuki said as another pair of officers hefted another kidnapper off the ground. The man's hammerhead shark appearance contrasted with the pile of broken teeth that pooled under where he lay. Whoever had done this had indeed fucked these guys up. Not enough to deal with these three, apparently, the detective said as he motioned towards the group's most petite man, the man's fox-like features clouded by his dual black eyes and swollen face. Turns out these guys run with a new crew. Locals say they're heavy hitters. Katsuki scoffed at the thought. There hadn't been anyone that could be called a heavy hitter since All Might killed that all for one bastard 5 years ago. Ever since then, anyone more challenging than a purse snatcher or bank robber had taken to the shadows of society, operating underground with little to no interaction with one another. The days of a sweeping criminal organization pulling the strings of Japanese crime had long since died. Some say killed for good at the hands of the former symbol of peace in what would become All Might's final public appearance before his retirement. If these thugs were supposed to be someone special, then Katsuki certainly never heard of them. Still, he might have been too up on the food chain to notice whenever a group of small fries tried to start something big. But attempted kidnapping, in the middle of a massive crowd in the busiest hostess club in all of downtown. It took some balls. Maybe these guys were connected to that human trafficking ring that Shitty Hair had told them about last week. It was something to look into, at least. Anyway, the hero on the scene took them out before we arrived. Fast work, Katsuki said as he calculated the time it took for the hero to stop the crime and apprehend and contain 3 violent criminals. Then administer first aid all before the police arrived at the scene. More impressive considering Katsuki knew just how quick of a response this particular department was known for. Effective too. All 3 were bound, and the victim received first aid before he called it in. The man said with a smile, happy to avoid the headache of dealing with minor professional pro heroes in the area. If only every hero on the streets were this clean. It was one of the positives of working the graveyard shift, Katsuki supposed, not having to deal with rookie heroes or worse students on their internships and work studies. Who is it? No idea, the old detective said as he took another puff of his cigarette. All I know is that he's new, and no one has ever heard of him before, but the witnesses say he's big, strong, and has a solid left hook. You didn't see him. Not a good look anyway, the old man responded. The fucker was fast. Katsuki growled again. It wasn't much to go on. He wasn't a fan of any new hero operating in his town without his say-so, but at the very least, whoever did this knew what they were doing. The same rookie officer who had stopped him before ran up to the old detective. Still, Katsuki wasn't paying much attention to them. He was too lost in thought as he surveyed the unfolding scene he had literally walked in on. He should get home, but he didn't want to deal with the headaches from soy sauce and Shitty Hair if he came home too early from his hot date. Or worse yet, if Raccoon Eyes was over to see Shitty Hair. Katsuki might as well put a bullet in his head right now to avoid that shit. He could at least grab a few hours of sleep at the office. Well, looks like you got yourself a chance at meeting the guy after all, the old detective said as he put out his cigarette. Got another call from a few blocks away. Our hero broke into a pachinko parlor and roughed up some employees. That sounded like something he'd expected from some bumbling thug, not the professional who did this. The confusion on Katsuki's face was noticeable as the old detective pulled out yet another cigarette. Turns out the parlor manager is the Hammerhead Shark's brother, the old man said, pointing to the handcuffed criminal Katsuki had noticed earlier. They also found 4 girls who were reported missing last night, handcuffed to a wall in the parlor's basement. Shit, so he interrogated the 3 criminals before he left. Not many heroes had the proper training to perform on-site interrogations, especially not ones as fast and effective as this one had to have been. Stopped a kidnapping and put down an entire trafficking ring in less than an hour. This guy works quick. As I said, fucker was fast, the old detective said as he watched the squad cars containing the 3 criminals pull away. Backup is already on the scene as we speak. Maybe you can even chat with the new guy on the block. You get a name. Dispatch said his name was Deku. The old man said with a laugh. What kind of hero name is that anyway? You know anyone like that? I'm not the traitor, Kak-chan. The voice from the cell sounded frail and tired, lack of sleep and hunger stripping the life and usual energy the voice usually held. They're lying. You have to tell All Might that. Please. Katsuki stood frozen, like his limbs had forgotten how to move as his body grew numb with shock. His breath hitched, and only through sheer force of will did he not allow himself to fall over on his face. Deku had done this. It was a name he had thought about a lot these past years. Not a day went by when Katsuki's mind didn't wander to the boy whose life he had ruined. But it was the first time in a long time anyone had actually said the name out loud before. It sounded foreign to Katsuki's ears, like a curse word from a language he didn't understand but whose meaning he knew instantly. You okay there, Ground Zero? The old man said as he lowered his smoke from his mouth, apparent worry filling his eyes. Katsuki swallowed the bile that threatened to leave his throat from the thoughts that raced through his mind. the mental image of deep green eyes burning into Katsuki's soul and making his skin crawl. I would never do something like this, Kak-chan. The teenager's scared voice broke through the cell's darkness. Don't you believe me? Hey, the old detective said, shaking the younger hero by his shoulder as forcefully as he could. Snap out of it, Ground Zero. Please, Kak-chan. The voice sounded even more broken as Katsuki walked away from the cell. Katsuki fully intended to never hear the voice that spoke out to him again. Don't leave me. Someone get me a medic. The old detective shouted, fear gripping his voice as he and two of his officers lowered the pro-hero to the ground. His skin was gaunt and white, and his eyes red, like the blood vessels in his eyes had become inflamed and exploded. We need help down here. This is what you deserve, Deku. Katsuki shouted, his voice twisted into murderous hatred that sounded almost demonic even to his own ears. For everything you did. He turned his back away from the imprisoned teenager, ignoring the weeps that followed the declaration. Instead, he smiled at the thought that the traitor was being punished for what he dared to do, what he would do to everyone else. Good riddance. He's going into shock. One of the paramedics screamed as Katsuki was placed into the ambulance, the rhythmic drips of drugs and oxygen masks doing little to settle the storm of emotions raging through him. Ground Zero, sir, can you speak to me? Duh. Katsuki's eyes stared off into nothing, tears spilling from his raw eyes as he relived the scene in his mind over and over again. That's right, keep talking, sir. The paramedic spoke, her fear subsiding for a moment as her patient vocalized what sounded like a word, which was a good sign. What are you trying to say? Deku, Katsuki said, his voice a sob as the drugs finally did their job, sending the pro-hero spiraling down into an unconscious heap. I'm so sorry. Chapter 3, Ida. This was the type of thing Tenya Ida, better known to his co-workers and the community at large as the Turbo Hero, Ingenium, hated the most about his day. Still, he knew this had to be done. Better to rip the bandage off quickly after all. The young speedster towered over the intern in front of him, making the head of the Team Idate Hero Agency wonder if he was ever that small while still in school. The boy in front of him was short but stocky, with a build of a wrestler that played well with his ability to absorb kinetic energy from the movement of his body. Effectively, this quirk turned the hero student's body into a living cannonball. A unique quirk, to be sure, but how he used it had quickly become a problem. Care to tell me what happened during your patrol last night? Tenya bore down on the younger man. His voice carried little anger but more than enough disappointment to let whoever heard him know he was serious. Sir, the teenager paused, looking somewhat confused for a moment as he readjusted his footing. I captured the villain. You went off on your own. Tenya cut him off, the tone of his voice enough to silence the younger teen. You disregarded your senior's orders and decided to chase after the criminal instead of helping the injured civilians. That's what you did. And in your pursuit, almost caused a car accident and nearly killed the criminal you were chasing, Tenya said. He wasn't shouting, but that almost made the situation feel worse. Tenya had reread the arrest and hospital reports for everyone involved nearly a dozen times since the night before, memorizing every detail of the case. A gang of 3 well-known lowlifes, small-time crooks looking for a bigger-than-average score. With the added 15-year-old dropout, they had convinced to take part in the armed robbery that would be their shot into the big time. Everyone involved with the crime, either hero, police, or victims, agreed that the fourth and far less willing member of the 4-person crew was far less villainous than his partners. He was far more in over his head than his aggressive compatriots, freezing at the sight of violence while trying and failing to convince his partners to leave before something got out of hand. The fact that the boy even dropped his weapon to surrender when the pro-heroes arrived was also noted. But, with all that said, it was a surprise for Tenya to see that boy was now in critical condition and by far the most injured of anyone involved with last night's escapades. What was I supposed to do? Let the villain go? The boy shouted back, gaining whatever courage he had left to speak up to his superior. What kind of hero lets a villain go when he can stop them? What kind of a hero brutalizes a quirkless teenager when he surrenders? Tenya said, flopping the tablet showing the security footage down on the desk. Likewise, what kind of hero ignores the potentially lethal car accident he caused to do so? The boy stilled for a moment, clearly surprised at the knowledge that what he did was caught on camera when he did it. It seemed the Hero Commission was doing a far less robust job with the country's hero ethics since the overhaul 5 years prior. The outcome was staring at him now with a dumbfounded look plastered on his face. A shattered orbital bone, internal bleeding, and a fractured skull. Tenya rattled the list of injuries off, his voice getting louder with each word. So tell me, how does that amount of damage happen when dealing with an untrained and unarmed combatant? What happened to following the basic rules of conduct? You could have killed someone out there by both your actions and inactions last night, Tenya shouted, shocking the intern a bit if going by the young man's face. It was the first time he had seen the engine hero speak like that to anyone, let alone him. Because of that, I am officially rescinding my internship offer to you, as well as sending in my recommendations to your school to remove you from the hero course. You can't do this, the boy shouted, fear and anger morphing his face into something far less human than it was a moment ago. Not over some quirkless. That's enough. Tenya cut him off with a shout, loud enough for Tenya to know that whoever was in the agency office was now fully aware of what was happening. You're lucky no one died, so I don't have to report this to the police, but as far as I'm concerned, your career in this agency is done. Look, I'm sorry, the teenager said, his anger subdued and replaced with fear and apprehension. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry for it. You have to believe me. You can't ruin my chances at being a pro because of a mistake. I'm not ruining your life. If anything, I might be saving it, Tenya said, readjusting his glasses as he stared directly into the intern's eyes. You must learn that hero work isn't about capturing bad guys but protecting the innocent. Not everyone who breaks the laws is a villain, and not everyone who follows the rules is innocent. I understand, Sensei, Tenya said as he straightened his posture to see if there was even a possibility that what the commission had said was true. Good, Eraserhead said with his usual stern tone of voice. Tenya could tell his teacher took these accusations seriously, which meant there was more to them than even Tenya could imagine. I want you to be careful around Midoriya until we have enough evidence to make our move. Tenya paused as he remembered his friend standing over him. Izuku's raw power shielding Tenya from the hero killer stain just a few weeks prior. Some of them didn't believe that the same boy back then could do what he was accused of. But what if he was wrong? What kind of hero would Tenya be if he allowed his personal feelings to get in between justice? I understand, Sensei. Tenya watched as the intern left his office like a zombie, as if every ounce of energy and happiness had been drained from his body. It wasn't until Tenya drained his first glass of whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden at the bottom of his desk that he was imbruing his own thoughts and feelings onto others yet again. It wasn't until he poured yet another drink from the quickly emptying bottle that he realized that today would be much longer than he thought when he woke up that morning. A knock at his door took Tenya out of his thoughts, causing him to quickly down whatever remained in his glass and hid the evidence before he allowed someone to enter his office. Are you gonna let me in or not? A familiar voice filled the room, causing Tenya to move towards the door faster than he would typically. He knew the consequences of leaving his girlfriend locked out of his office for more than a moment. The coffee is getting cold. Mei Hatsum strolled into the room like she owned the place. Considering her position as a head support consultant for Team Idaten and her dating the owner, it was more or less accurate. Besides, no one openly told Mei she couldn't do anything once she decided to do it. So if she wanted to have a quick breakfast with her boyfriend before she isolated herself in her lab for the next day and a half, then that's what she was going to do. You didn't have to do that. Tenya started, grabbing the loose bags of food from his girlfriend's hands, already trying to take whatever burden from her hands the best he could. The doctor said, "Oh, zip it, legs," Mei said with a smile as she sat down in front of Tenya's desk with a smile on her face and a hand resting on her stomach. I heard this enough from the doc already. Just think of it as a little mommy-daughter time. Despite her annoyance, it was the first thing people noticed about Mei these days. But the woman was 8 months pregnant, and despite her insistence to the contrary, everyone Mei ran into these days seemed to only care about one thing about her. Not her latest inventions, but her growing stomach. Tenya figured that if Mei had to stop working on her latest prototype over someone asking about the baby one more time, the engineer would kill someone. What kind of random person asked strangers if they started lactating anyway? It was a shock for Tenya when he discovered Mei's pregnancy, mainly because, for his life, Tenya thought he took all the precautions he could regarding the private matters he and Mei had, but it seemed life had other plans. If someone had told him, he would have been the first in his class to have a child so soon after school. He would have called them a liar and then told them it was unbecoming to be talking about that thing on school grounds. But here he was now, a month away from being a father. Tenya said nothing as he watched his girlfriend and mother of his future child set up for their meal. She made room on the spotless and orderly desk for the omelets and crisp slices of bacon and fish Mei must have prepared herself before making her way to his office. Tenya remembered when he and Mei first got together that the engineer could barely make a sandwich without burning something to the ground. But say what you will about the president of Hatsum Industries. When that woman set her mind to something, she didn't stop until she was the best at it. His mother had been ecstatic when the pink-haired woman had asked her for cooking lessons. Not a day had passed since then that his mother didn't ask him when he was going to get off his backside and ask Mei to marry him. So I'm guessing your intern didn't work out, huh? Mei said, cutting to the chase as was her habit. I told you before that you should have gone for an intern from UA. Every other school has kind of fallen off, you know. Mei, of course, was right. The two had had an animated discussion about Tenya's refusal to take an intern from his alma mater. Even years after his graduation, UA was still considered the best hero school in all of Japan, despite everything that happened. I'm sorry, Midoriya. Tenya spoke, the tone of his voice emotionless and robotic as he stared down at his shorter classmate. But perhaps we could hang out together some other time. I've already made prior arrangements. It's fine, Ida, the green-haired boy said, trying to hide whatever disappointment he must have felt with a smile. It's just that everyone has been acting really strange these past few weeks. I just can't figure out why, you know. Tenya said nothing as he watched the boy turn away from him. It was harder than Tenya thought it would be, but it was something he knew had to be done to protect the rest of the class. They had all agreed to it, of course. Until more information could be gathered about Izuku's crimes, no one in Izoa meant no one was allowed anywhere near Izuku without a faculty or commission agent nearby. A part of Tenya wished this didn't have to be the case, but that part felt smaller than it did at the beginning of the investigation the more evidence became uncovered. Registered quirkless at age 4. No history of a quirk until the day of their entrance exam. A father whose entire identity was considered so off the grid, the more it seemed like the name Izuku Midoriya was nothing more than an alias for a man who didn't want to be found. The raw power behind his quirk that seemed almost supernatural sometimes. Tenya bit his lip to stop himself from calling out to the boy as he disappeared into the crowd of faceless students. Despite knowing what he was doing was right, he couldn't help but feel a chill run up his spine as the words of his teachers and the Hero Commission representatives filled his ears. "You okay, Legs?" they asked, pausing to take another bite of her eggs as she looked at her boyfriend. "Did I oversalt the fish again?" "No, it is fine," Tenya said before shoving a piece of his breakfast into his mouth, swallowing it without even chewing to convince his girlfriend there was nothing wrong with her latest cooking attempt. "I just have a lot on my mind recently. You know, if something is bothering you, you can tell me, right?" they said in a quiet voice, sounding far smaller than someone like Mei Hatsum had the right to ever sound like. "So you don't have to stress out all by yourself, right?" "I know," Tenya responded, his eyes drifting away from the pink-haired woman. "It's nothing serious, I assure you. I just don't want you to stress more than you already do. With the baby." "Oh please," the support engineer said with a smirk as she placed a hand on her belly. "This baby is already a tough cookie. Just like her mama." Tenya smiled as he watched Mei smile, feeling his mood brighten slightly at the sight. Mei could always drag him out of a bad mood through sheer pigheadedness and willpower, an aspect of her personality that only seemed to grow as she got older. "But since that intern of yours is a no-go, I can always shoot a message to Power Loader if you want," they said as she cracked open an energy drink, the one brand of energy drink in the country that was deemed medically safe for pregnant women. "He owes me a couple of favors, and I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 first years not feeling their chosen internships." Tenya sighed again at the mention of his former school, but the fact was that UA might be the last place he wanted to look for a possible intern. Even after graduating years ago, the wound of UA still lingered, like a cut refusing to scab over. He felt for the scar on his shoulder, the mark left him by the hero killer stain back in his first year, feeling the long-since-healed injury burn under his clothing. It might have been far worse, he thought to himself, if it hadn't been for Izuku. Tenya paused from his meal, the name bouncing off of each corner of his head as he silently stared back to the desk drawer where he kept his liquor bottle hidden away. Truth be told, there hadn't been a day in the past 5 years where Tenya didn't think of Izuku Midoriya. He was his best friend, after all. Was his best friend. "We don't have to talk about this now if you don't want to," Mei said, her voice sad as she looked down at her food plate, toying with a piece of green spinach she cooked into her eggs. "I know it's hard for you, but, Midoriya, please don't make this harder than it has to be," Tenya said, his voice slightly muffled from behind his hero uniform's metal face mask. "Listen to the heroes and surrender yourself before any of us do something we might regret. Speak for yourself," a voice called out from Tenya's side, a voice he couldn't place but knew he had heard before. "I'm just waiting for an excuse to put the traitor down." "Tenya, what's happening?" Izuku said as he repositioned his back against the wall, whether out of fear or in an attempt to minimize the chances of someone sneaking up from behind him. "Just tell me what this is all about. Whatever this is about, we can fix this. The time for talking is over." Their teacher's voice spoke up from the crowd, his red eyes glaring onto the form of the now momentarily powerless hero student. "Just get on your knees and raise your hands over your head, or else we will have to treat you as an enemy combatant." Tenya watched as Izuku's eyes widened at the underground hero's words, looking towards anyone in the crowd in front of him for any semblance of emotion beyond anger and disgust. Hida watched as Izuku made a fist with his hands, green electricity radiating off his body despite their teacher's quirk being activated. A rumble moved throughout the assembled heroes and students. This had to have been the power of All for One. A power that not even Eraserhead's quirk could hope to suppress. No typical quirk had this type of raw power after all. No natural quirk anyway. "I'm sorry, Midoriya," Tenya said as his engine roared to life, his classmates and teachers readying beside him. "But you forced us to do this. If you want to talk about it," Mei answered as she placed her hand onto Tenya's own, forcing the taller man to look her in the eye as she stood over his seated form. "I'm more than willing to listen." Tenya sighed as he placed his hand into his girlfriend's, squeezing the woman's smaller hands as the thoughts in his head made the room swirl around him. 5 years had already passed, and even the memory of what he did was still enough to make him want to crawl into a dark room and drink until he was a blubbering mess on the floor. Tenya was going to answer her before his words were cut off by the ringing of his office phone. He usually didn't work Saturday mornings, only coming into the office this morning to handle the issue with his former intern. Unfortunately, it was also so early that the Team Idaitan agency wasn't officially open. Only a few early birds who wanted to get some overtime pay at their desks. Tenya was willing to let the phone ring, deciding that whatever the reason wasn't as important as spending time with Mei. "You might want to pick that up," Mei said as she cracked open yet another energy drink. "It's gotta be important for someone to call before your office is open, right?" Tenya couldn't fault the logic as he reached over to pick up the ringing phone off his desk, catching the familiar voice on the other end of the line by surprise. "I'm telling you he's not," the voice said, speaking to another party in the background before he focused his attention back on Tenya when he heard the phone line connection. "Oh shit, you're there. Hey, Ida, it's me, Kirishima. Tenya felt his lips turn into a small smile as he listened to the golden retriever-like voice of the sturdy hero Red Riot. It had been a long time since the two had talked. Still, Kirishima was one of the few members of his former class. They operated closely enough to Tenya that the occasional team-up wasn't an impossibility. Or at least Kirishima was one of the few heroes from his former class who worked near Tenya that Tenya was willing to work with. Good morning, Red Riot, Tenya said in his practiced and professional tone of voice, ignoring the smirk on his girlfriend's face as he did so. What can I do for you? Katsuki, Kirishima said, his voice becoming a low whisper as he spoke like he was telling Tenya some grand secret. Something happened to him last night, and he's in the hospital. Tenya stiffened as he listened to the redhead's words, squashing down the intense distaste Tenya felt for the explosive quirk user as he did so. It wasn't a secret that the two never got along well in school. Whatever relationship they could have had become unsalvageable by the time they graduated. The two barely spoke more than a few sentences to one another in the class of reunions they attended these past 5 years. But whatever dislike Tenya felt for the man, Tenya wasn't the type to wish misery on anyone, especially a fellow hero. What happened? Here's the thing. I don't actually know. Kirishima's voice spoke up again, evident distress and confusion tinting each word out of his mouth. He says he's fine, but beyond that, he's not saying much. So doctors are going to release him this afternoon. That's good, Tenya said, readjusting his glasses, a habit he formed whenever he thought he was waiting on bad news. Whatever injury he received isn't something to worry about. Katsuki wasn't injured by a villain. Kirishima's voice spoke back up, interrupting Tenya's line of thought with yet another surprise. He wasn't on patrol last night. The EMTs that brought him in said he just sort of started freaking out at a crime scene and was rushed to the nearest emergency room. That was certainly odd. Say what you wanted about Katsuki Bakugo. He wasn't the type to react in such an extreme manner for no reason. Whatever had been the cause of something like this had to have been serious. The doctors say he's fine, and the only thing Bakugo is saying beyond that to me is that he needs to tell everyone something vital. Kirishima paused, Tenya almost imagining the man turning his head to ensure no one was listening in before finishing. It's kind of freaking me out, to be honest. Let me guess. Katsuki asked you to call me because he wasn't sure I'd pick up the phone if it was him. Bingo, class president. Despite the situation, Kirishima still managed to find his sense of humor. Todoroki says he might be able to make an appearance as long as you were going. But you're Raka. I can't say I'm surprised, Tenya said, thinking of the last time the gravity and explosion user was in the same room as the other. The memory of brown eyes full of tears was enough to swear off another one of Mina's get-togethers for a while, or else he would put Nito through a wall. I don't exactly know what Bakugo wants to talk about, but it might be for the best if we leave Ochako out of it right now. Yeah. The voice on the other line drifted off like Kirishima was thinking along the same line as Tenya was for a brief moment. So that might be for the best after all. The conversation paused for a moment, the same way every exchange broke for Tenya whenever he spoke with one of his former classmates, even for the ones he kept in contact with and still considered his close friends. However, the unspoken topic that seemed to weigh on everyone's mind seemingly came to the surface whenever one spoke to another. It was hard for Tenya to keep in touch with his former classmates. For a while, Tenya thought of them like a second family, an admission that only made him want to weep at what tore them all apart. Kirishima didn't have to say a word for Tenya to know the redhead was thinking about Izuku at that moment. God knew Tenya was. I'll see you soon, Kiri, Tenya said, ending the conversation before one of them broke their class's unspoken agreement. We should do something soon, something that doesn't involve villains and hospital visits. Yeah, Kirishima said awkwardly but honestly as the phone call ended. I'd like that. Tenya stood motionless for a few moments, just listening to the sound of his phone's dial tone as he hung up. For some reason, Tenya couldn't get over the strange feeling that filled his gut about what was about to happen, like a cow being led to slaughter. Well, that sounds ominous, they said with a small smile as she tried to ease the tension she saw growing on her boyfriend's face. Anything serious? Just a bad feeling. Tenya's answered honestly, seeing no reason to lie to his girlfriend. But, unfortunately, Bakugo is in the hospital. Oh shit. He's fine, according to Kirishima anyway, Tenya said as he took a bite out of his thankfully still warm eggs before plating another piece of fried fish onto his plate. Apparently, he has something he wants to tell our old class. Hasn't he heard of texting? I guess he thinks it is serious enough that he wants to tell it all to our faces, Tenya said as she took a huge sip of his orange juice, downing the entirety of the bottle in a single gulp. It has been a while since we've all been in the same room. But they won't be all together, will they? A part of him wanted to call Ochako. The last thing he wanted to do was leave the woman out of the loop despite her distaste and growing aversion for her ex-boyfriend. But something stopped him. Whatever had happened, Ochako would find out eventually. That always seemed to be the case whenever a new detail appeared in one of their lives. Tenya just hoped that whatever Bakugo wanted to say was worth whatever drama would sprout from this. Turns out I got a lot of weird private messages about me choosing to imply Ochako and Bakugo were in a relationship. Some people hated it and some people demanded I make them endgame. So to put it to rest right here and now, romance will not be a huge factor in this story. I'm not good at writing it and I think pairings and shipping distract from this type of story. However, I will say the same thing to you as the people telling me to never write gay ships. The more you tell me not to do something, the more I am likely to do it out of spite. If you'll want to throw a tip in my direction, Ko-fi it will invite that guy. It is greatly appreciated if you choose, no worries if you can't. Chapter 4, Mina. The following is a fan-based parody. I own nothing of this property. It is owned by its respective owners. Please support the official release. Mina stared at herself in the mirror. The sight of smeared concealer and running eyeliner staring back at her almost mockingly. She looked like an empty husk of her normal self, her usual bright pink skin sapped of its characteristic warmth and shade. When she had woken up a few hours before, she was a confident, professional hero living her best life. Now, everything she had tried so hard to move on from had come crashing back on her. The tears and anxieties she had thought she had conquered came roaring back like the growls of Gigantomachia that still caused her nightmares. The bangs and shouting from the outside world interrupted Mina's thoughts, at once reminding the pink-skinned woman that she'd already spent more time away from her friends than she intended. She was a prominent pro-hero hiding in a public bathroom. At the same time, her friends and classmates were busy tearing themselves apart. Who was she trying to fool anyway? It wasn't like she was helping matters much. Although 5 years later, her class was still broken despite her best efforts. She could hide away in this bathroom and have no effect on the chaos erupting just a few meters away. What was she going to do? Smile and pretend she didn't die a little inside when she saw Ida stare at her with blank eyes. Keep an eye on Momo, so she doesn't get any ideas and pop more of those anxiety pills than she should at once. Hold on to Kirishima and pray to whatever god still thought Mina was worth something that her boyfriend didn't fall into the same pit of despair he did back then. Her own sweet Kiri was almost lost to her forever, and here she was, wallowing and feeling sorry for herself. No, she wasn't going to let that happen again. Deep breath, Mina said to herself as she plastered her best smile back onto her face, a smile that even she would admit looked strained and barely held together. Her reflection looked as broken and gutted as Mina felt, and not for the first time. The hallway was empty, the few nurses and hospital workers thankfully ignoring her as she made her way back to Katsuki's room. She was just glad Katsuki had lucked out and was taken to one of the few hospitals in the city that took hero privacy seriously. She remembered not fondly waking up from surgery during her second full year on the job. Having a bullet removed from her abdomen was not the best start for her day, but finding a mass of reporters waiting outside her room for hours was somehow worse. So who cared about her new line of swimwear when there were people who could have died? Nothing but a bunch of gossip hounds not caring about who they hurt as long as they get their exclusive. Is it true what they're saying about Midoriya's mom? Mina asked, her voice soft to not alert the rest of her classmates. The Midoriya subject was still raw for many Class 1A. If Mina could avoid ripping open the still healing wounds, she would. But she still had to know. Unfortunately, yes, her teacher said solemnly, his eyes not betraying the disappointment in how a civilian had been dragged into public life because of the actions of her son. The commission has put a protection detail to ensure another incident doesn't happen again. But still, Midoriya's mom was innocent, right? There was no evidence conveying the Midoriya matriarch was anything beyond a loving mother who had the unfortunate luck of loving someone who didn't deserve it. So it wasn't her fault her son turned out to be a villain, right? So why would? Don't worry, Mina, this type of thing happens sometimes, the racer had said with a small smile, the first smile Mina remembered gracing the underground heroes' faces since Izuku's arrest a few weeks ago. Give it time, and the vultures will find something else to report on. Just an average day for her, after all. God, Mina hated reporters. Oh, you're back. A solemn voice broke Mina out of her thoughts as Shoji's colossal form met her vision when she turned the corner. I was afraid you left. You don't have to worry about that, Splatoon, Mina said, some pep returning for a moment to get her large friend to smile. Mina Shido would never willingly leave without saying goodbye. The tentacled hero smiled, or at least the thin line of his lips curved upward slightly, which she counted as a smile considering the situation. What's going on in there? Mina said, trying to maintain the peppy energy she was known for. What's with all the noise? Shoji sighed as one of his extra arms pulled out yet another cigarette from the ever-quicking empty pack. The hand that held the cigarette pack lit it before morphing into another mouth before Shoji answered. Just Bakugo being Bakugo, Shoji said before taking a long drag of his cigarette, his colossal body almost shrinking as he exhaled the smoke. I just needed to get out of there for a second. Did anyone leave yet? Not that I saw, Shoji said with another drag of his cigarette, sighing as the smoke filled whatever number of lungs he formed inside his body. I don't think anyone is going to be leaving for a while. I know I won't be. Mina sighed as she turned to look to the closed door leading to Katsuki's room, the sounds of shouts mixing into a grumble of some great beast ready to swallow her whole once again. She felt her lips quiver again but held the sob back. Mina knew that if she started crying now, she wouldn't stop until her eyes burned from her acid. You going back in? You coming? I will in a minute, Shoji said as he lit another cigarette. Yet, another mouth formed below his face as he spoke, now joining the rest of his body and taking as much of the drug as Shoji could handle. It was a habit the tentacled hero formed whenever he was stressed, but not one where Mina knew exactly when he started. Just want to be alone for a bit. When did you start smoking anyway? Mina asked as she turned to open the door, prepping her ears for the chaos in her absence. About 5 years ago, Shoji said as he turned away from her, his mind already a million miles away from the hospital. Mina's appearance did nothing to diffuse the tension as her former classmates ignored her, their eyes glued onto the unfolding scene in front of her. Then why don't you do something about it? Katsuki said, taking a step closer to Kaminari, the electricity hero's eyes wide in shock and dismay as his friend did so. If you have a problem with what I said to him, why don't you make me stop? Katsuki was out of bed, his hospital scrubs replaced with the dress shirt and slacks he had worn the night before. He looked out of place with the hero uniforms and casual weekend wear of the people around him. It would have been almost funny to see it any other day, but today it felt hollow. That's enough, Bakugo, Kirishima said, getting between the forms of his fighting friends. Still, Mina could see the underlying sense of dread fill his body. Despite what Kiri would admit out loud, he expected violence to happen if the telltale sign of his cracking and jagged forearms meant anything. No, let him say what he wants to say. Ada responded, the ex-class president looking at his hot-headed compatriot with disdain. Go on, Katsuki. Why don't you tell me exactly why I should have invited Ochako? So she can hear from a guy she wants nothing to do with telling her that Midoriya. The name was enough to make Mina recoil slightly, like someone had slapped her face as the world around her slowed to a crawl. Her mind raced to and fro, trying to find anything that could cut through the awkward situation. But, unfortunately, she found no port in the storm, no lifeline to grab onto, no lighthouse to signal safe passage as wave after wave of regret and self-loathing dragged her and her friends further down into misery. Momo was still crying. She had been the first of the assembled group to do it, but she was far from the only one. She leaned heavily into her boyfriend's shoulder, the half-and-half number 12 hero looking almost frozen solid as he numbly held onto her. Mina feared that if Momo hadn't been there with him, Shoto would have joined Ada for whatever Katsuki had said to set the taller man off. Kaminari was held back by Shiro and Ajiro, the tape user trying desperately to keep Kaminari out of whatever physical altercation was about to unfold between Ada and Katsuki. All the while, Sato and Kirishima, their faces twisted into masks of strained emotionless compliance, stayed close to Katsuki. Kiri's hands hovered over his best friend's shoulder to rein in Katsuki's worst tendencies when he was angry or sad. Jairo was just staring off into nothing. Her eyes were glossy from unshed tears, but she looked more numb and emotionless than they did anything else. Jairo had never entirely confided with Mina about the Izuku situation, but if the music she had written these past 5 years meant anything to go by, then well. The fact that the punk rocker had just shut down emotionally when the news hit shouldn't surprise Mina too much. Like a black hole had eaten every semblance of happiness that used to be in her life. Toro had folded into herself, holding her knees to her face as she tried to make herself look as small as she must have felt she was. Besides Kiri, Mina had known Toro the longest out of all the people in the room. Despite her invisible features, Mina could read the girl like a book. The girl was just about a few moments away from a panic attack, one Mina knew from experience would rage through the day if left unchecked. Mina moved across the room and wrapped her arm around the floating blouse, trying desperately to hug the panic attack away before it fully arrived. Sue, bless her heart, leaned heavily into her boyfriend's shoulder as she wept, crying harder than Mina could remember the frog girl ever crying before. Takoyami's quirk wrapped itself around the frog girl like a blanket as its master tried and failed to control his emotions. Ochako ... wasn't there, something Mina was upset over at first. She had as much of a right to hear this as everyone else here, even more so if Mina was honest, but now she was internally grateful for it. Sue, Ida, and Shoto would need to be the ones to tell her about this. Katsuki lost the right to be the bearer of her terrible news long ago. If only Mina had kept her stupid mouth shut all those years ago. I'm telling you guys, Mina whispered to her classmates. Her room allowed her some level of privacy, but not enough for her to speak her mind as comfortably as she might have wanted. Ochako hasn't left her room for days. Can you blame her? Jairo said as she fiddled with her ear jack. The bruised and battered punk rocker looked worse for wear despite the ordeal they had gone through with the former member of their class. Her best friend betrayed the school and was working with the people who wanted us dead. It was true. It may have been a tough pill to swallow that Midoriya had been secretly feeding their mortal enemies all of their secrets and had plotted to kill them multiple times. But it was one they needed to quickly get used to before they could even hope to move on. It would do no one any good anymore, after all. I know that, Mina said defensively as she rubbed the side of her arm, the same one the traitor had wrapped one of those creepy black tendrils over in his escape attempt. She was lucky he hadn't ripped it off. But that doesn't mean we can sit here and let her wallow with a broken heart. What do you suggest then? Sue asked, her ordinarily emotionless eyes telling Mina that while the frog girl wasn't entirely on board with what Mina was planning, she'd be willing to try anything to make Ochako a semblance of how she used to be. Mina smiled as she saw the other girls slowly agreeing with her. After all, the best way to get over heartbreak was to find someone else, or at least that's what those teen dramas always said, and Mina had the perfect guy for the job. Shut your mouth, Four Eyes, Katsuki growled, small explosions erupting between his fingers like a not-so-hidden threat. Or something terrible is going to happen to you. No, you're so right, Tenya said, taking a step back and lifting his arms upwards, almost daring Katsuki to throw the first punch. It's not the great Katsuki Bakugo, who was the first guy who started shit-talking Midoriya at the beginning of our first year. It was all Hitoshi's fault. Mia felt sick the more she thought of it. Had this been what they were arguing over? The person who took Midori's spot in their class. How was he handling all this? Mina turned her head, looking to and fro for the underground hero who was here before she had run out of the room, finding only an open window indicating where the boy had left from. Kaminari, Mina said, trying to de-escalate the situation before it got any worse. Katsuki's hand glowed brighter with each word he heard. Why don't you? No, because Katsuki over here can never ever admit when he fucks up. It's gotta be everyone else's fault, Kaminari shouted, breaking himself free from Shiro's grip as he turned back to the scowling face of Katsuki. It's not like he fucked up like the rest of us, because Katsuki fucking Bakugo is too damn smart. Ain't ya? If looks could kill. You wanna go too, Sparky? Katsuki said. His eyes had a dangerous glint to them, even more than usual. Katsuki had always been a bit of a hothead. It was a part of his charm, after all. But this, let me guess, Kaminari said as he looked Katsuki square in the eye. It's all Shinso's fault that Chaco dumped your ass too. The sound of flesh and bone hitting flesh and bone filled Mina's ears. She could do nothing but watch as Katsuki delivered a punch to Kaminari's jaw, knocking the electric quirk user to the ground. You shut your mouth, Katsuki screamed as Sato and Kirishima dragged the enraged explosion user away from the downed Kaminari. The two muscular and powerful young men struggled to suppress Katsuki as he struggled and fought with everything his body could produce. You shut your stupid fucking mouth, you dumb piece of fucking shit. Fuck you, you fucking asshole, Kaminari shouted back, the lower half of his face already swelling as he was held back from retaliating by Takoyomi and what looked to be a crying dark shadow. Knock it off, Mina shouted, tears running down her face as she tried to stop the chaos from getting more out of hand. How could things have gotten so bad? She had only been gone for a few minutes and everything just escalated. Please just stop. The tears Mina had fought so long to control broke free as her whole body rocked with her sobs. So here she was, a grown woman and professional hero, just ugly crying in front of her friends because she was too weak to keep her emotions in check. I'm a disgrace, Mina said to herself, remembering the words her childhood bullies would say to her growing up, about how she was too dumb and emotional to do anything right, let alone be a pro hero. I'm a fucking disgrace. She felt arms around her body, and Mine didn't need to open her eyes to know that Kiri was holding on to her, his skin hardening to avoid the burns her tears would create. For a moment, they just stood there, and for a moment, Mina didn't care about anything else happening. She didn't care about Katsuki's anger. She didn't care about her friends trying to kill one another. All she wanted was for things to return to the way things used to be. Was that too much to ask? I'm sorry, Kaminari, Katsuki said, whatever anger filled his voice, leaving him as he slunk back to his bed. I'm sorry. Kaminari didn't say anything back, but his eyes never left Katsuki's. For a moment, Mina feared that the tentative peace would be broken again. But Kamari, like many times before her, had surprised her. I'm not the one you owe an apology to, Bakugo. His voice was solid but pained, like the words he spoke were made of lead. You know Shinso still blames himself. We all do. Not like Shinso, Tsu said, her voice cracking as she spoke. Tsu had always been blunt, but Mina felt like the frog girl's words felt like a hammer to the back of her head at the moment. None of us are the guy who took Izuku's spot in our class. The room stilled, so quiet Mina hadn't realized Shoji had re-entered the room to quietly wrap an arm around a far too quiet Kota. Mina looked at Shota, the shame on his face almost making her want to cry again as she tried to calm herself down. Everyone in the room remembered the words they had said to Shinso to make him feel welcome in their class the day he arrived. The terrible things they had all said or thought of Izuku to make Shina feel comfortable were still enough to make Mina feel her skin crawl when she thought of them. But for Shinso, to have Izuku Midoriya, of all people, hang over your head. To have all the baggage of seeing yourself as the one who took everything from the betrayed boy. The same boy who was the first person in Shinso's life to believe in his dream. Mina didn't want to think about it. It was no surprise that Shinso had tried to drop out of the hero course. Her entire class, only a few weeks from the end of their second year of school, had already been indicated with threats of withdrawal. Mina already had half her room packed by the time Miss Midnight had sat her down to convince her otherwise. Mina knew she wasn't the only one who wanted to drop out. To admit that she had lost whatever right she used to call herself a hero long ago. Even now, she found herself, more often than not, keeping Kiri from announcing an early retirement whenever his demons got the better of him. In the end, only Yuga made the gut-wrenching decision to leave the class, the blonde tearfully proclaiming that he had lost his sparkle over the whole ordeal. Someone's gotta have to tell Aoyama about this, Mina said as she wiped the tears from her eyes and blew back the unfortunate amount of acid that left her nose. He has that fashion show in Paris this week and deserves to know. I'll tell him, Momo said as she stood up. Her face was red and puffy, and for the first time in her life didn't look like the unstoppable big sis she was to the rest of the girls in their class. I'll video call him when he has a free moment. Mina almost forgot that Momo and Aoyama had gone into business together after her graduation. The two used both of their family influence to get a head start for not just their careers but the careers of the rest of their class. Except Midori, who's gonna tell Minta, Zero said from his spot, scratching his cheek as he looked at the group in front of him. The dude is still not back from his honeymoon yet. I don't want to ruin that for him. Oh God, had it only been a week since Minta got married. It seemed so long ago, thinking about all of her friends' smiling faces celebrating together. They had been so happy together, putting aside their issues to come together after so long apart. Laughing, drinking, taking pictures, and just not what they were doing right now. Let him enjoy the honeymoon first, Ida responded, readjusting his glasses as he slowly calmed down from the beat Katsuki within an inch of his life soapbox he had been standing these past few minutes. We can tell him when he gets back and gets settled. What about Shinso? Kota said, his quiet voice hoarse and strained as he spoke. How? Don't worry, Kota, Kaminari said with a small smile that didn't seem as strained as the ones Mina tried to keep on her face. He just needs some time alone, but he'll talk to him and make sure no one here blames him for what happened more than we blame ourselves. And Ochako, you leave her to me? Ada said. If he saw the look on Katsuki's face when he said it, he didn't show it. Even though Mina was thankful not to see Ochako's reaction to this news. The fact that the gravity user would be one of the last people to know the truth hurt Mina deep in her soul. Ochako had been too good of a friend and person to deserve this, yet. Mina looked around the assembled group in front of her. Their broken faces stared back at her like a mockery of real people, like seeing strangers wearing Halloween costumes of all her friends. She squeezed Kirishima tighter to herself. The only thing going through her mind was the desire to go home and sleep the misery away. Mina stared at the scene before her with shocked eyes as the traitor gripped his hand against Shoto's throat. The son of the number 2 hero stared up at the green-haired boy with hatred radiating from his two colored eyes. Even without numbering him and all their planning and backup, the traitor still defeated them. Mina rolled over to her side, the dust and debris hiding the form of their attacker from her view. Whatever doubt was in her heart was gone once she saw the insane and unnatural power of Midoriya's quirk. Enough that not even the combined force of UA and the Hero Commission forces could contend with. If All Might was here, but he wasn't here. The number 1 hero had left weeks before, trying to hunt down the man who had given Midoriya his quirk. To put a final nail into the villain's criminal empire and end all the pain and misery that had seemingly followed them all year. They thought they could do this without All Might's help, to be real heroes and stand up for what was right. The combined strength of UA should have been enough. If it had been anyone else, it would have been, but the traitor had studied their tactics, moves, and quirks until he knew them as well as they did themselves. And Shoto was about to pay the ultimate price for their hubris. I didn't want to do this, the traitor shouted, the green arcs of electricity glowing through the dust like the semblance of a demon. Why are you making me do this to you? Was he blaming them, like he wasn't the reason all this was happening? It made Mina sick to think that she had once considered that boy her friend, that she had once considered him good enough for Ochako, the same boy who had played a part in the attack on the USJ, the crippling of their teacher, the attack at the summer camp, the attempted murder of all of her friends and Katsuki's abduction. Even after everything he had done, he still dared to pretend he was a victim. Katsuki was right about him all along. You know what you did, Shoto spat, glaring at the boy she considered his first real friend. The love he held for the boy morphed into hatred at the monster the boy secretly was. Al, this is because of you. Don't try and hide it. The traitor said nothing as he stared at Shoto, his eyes radiating with an emotion that Mina had never seen before. Like his heart was breaking with each word Shoto said to him. Please, Deku. A voice that sounded like Ochako said from within the darkness, pain, and desperation dripping from her voice as she spoke. You've hurt too many people already. You have to stop this before you make it worse. Despite the dust and smoke disappearing, Mina couldn't see where Ochako was, but she could tell she was close. If she could distract the traitor for just a bit longer. Ochako, the boy turned to his former friend, his eyes betraying none of the malice he held in his body as he stared at the girl. I have no idea what you're talking about. Just tell me what this is about. Young Midoriya. A booming voice broke through the chaos, making Mina's heart almost beat out of her chest. It was him. Put the boy down and face me. All Might. The traitor spoke, confusion and relief filling his voice in equal measure as he turned to where the voice came from. A sick smile crossed the traitor's face before his body became stiff and rigid. Looks like your reign of terror is over, traitor, Shinsu said with a weak smile, his body close to exhaustion as he dragged his body across the ground. Now go to sleep. Izuku obeyed the general studies student's words. The boy's green eyes closed before he hit the shattered pavement, dropping the still injured Shoto to the ground as he did so. But as the cries of celebration and cheers filled the halls of their school when the police arrived to take Izuku into custody, Mina couldn't get the sight out of her head. Why had Izuku sounded so hopeful that All Might had returned? What had he been planning for the symbol of peace? What exactly was he going to do? Mina hugged his head deeper into Kirishima's shoulder, crying even harder than she did a moment ago. She had been so wrong. They had been so wrong about everything. Why was she so stupid? Why didn't she try to understand what was happening and why Izuku kept his secrets from them? Why did she have to react the way that she did? And how could she make it better? But as the thoughts of how she could fix what she had broken died in her head, only the numbness of her mistakes remained. She just wanted Kirishima to keep holding her until the world started returning to normal. Back when the world made sense and Mina could look at herself in the mirror and not cringe when she saw her reflection. Still, she feared any chance of that happening was as dead as she felt inside at this very moment. Yoyo, it's everyone's favorite uncle that isn't your actual uncle and is just some guy who writes fanfics on the internet that you just so happen to read. How's everybody doing? Good, good. I'm not gonna lie to you, I have a lot of positive reviews regarding this story and all that, so I'm gonna keep it real with you. I just caught some guy copy and pasting this story on another site that has since been eased. I don't want to add any more drama to this situation, so I'm gonna reiterate my thoughts on my work. I hold the opinion that if I've completed a story, which means it's marked as complete or I say I won't continue it, I give you the permission to either write a continuation or a sequel story that basically follows what I've written before. If it's a one-shot you want to see made into a series, have at it, and make more. All I ask is that you mention the original story, that's really it. I've given people permission to do this individually, but I'm gonna make it a general rule going forward. That being said, copying and pasting this story or any other story I have written onto a different site is a no-go. I think that's more than fair. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. To make up for these, please leave a review and favorite or follow anything else you crazy kids do these days. Chapter 5, Nedzu. The following is a fan-based parody. I own nothing of this property. It is owned by its respective owners. Please support the official release. Nedzu did not want to be here. In fact, out of all the places he could spend his Sunday morning in, the office of the Hero Commission president had to be one of the last in the long list of locations. Right between Tartarus and being locked back in a cage at the unnamed government laboratory he had been forced to call home for far too many years. Principal Nedzu. The president smiled, the practiced gesture looking almost natural on the woman's face as she stared down at him. What a pleasure. What can I do for you this fine day? You know why I'm here, the white-furred educator said, his voice curt as he stared at the woman before him with disgust and pity. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking this will be a pleasant conversation. The woman smiled again, and not for the first time. Nedzu was reminded that humans, indeed, were a despicable species. Although, of course, the woman before him was intelligent, in her own way, far too wise to hope to play dumb with him convincingly. But still, here she was, staring him down like she was some sort of innocent bystander instead of the would-be power broker she was trying to be. Especially one who had just relighted a bomb she was lucky hadn't blown up in her face the last time she tempted fate. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. The woman persisted, as a child who was caught with her hand in the cookie jar would, proclaiming her innocence with crumbs on her face. Would you like some tea? You seem to be in one of your poor moods this morn. The slam of the tablet onto her desk cut her off, Nedzu's small black eyes savoring the shock and fear that crossed the woman's face for a brief moment. Where did you get this? Her voice hissed like a viper, a sound that made the fur on Nedzu's back stand up out of some misplaced instinct. This is confidential information and I'm afraid you will be hard-pressed to know exactly who leaked this information, Nedzu responded with a smile. After all, half of this nation's top 10 are alumni of my school, and quite a bit more of them are as disappointed as I am about this type of response. Ordering the most senior heroes in the country to remain silent under legal penalties isn't likely to be viewed very favorably. I see, she answered, her tone dropping the fake friendliness she spoke with as she rubbed her palms together in aggravation and annoyance. I honestly didn't expect you, of all people, to care about him after all these years. Once a student, always a student, Nedzu said, his voice sounding far more akin to his animal genetics than it did in years. However, the question remains, why did you open wounds that should have never been made at all? The president took the electronic device into her hands, pretending to read the confidential message sent to every hero in the top 10 rankings regarding Izuku Midoriya with a calculating eye. But, of course, it was a ruse, a show for his benefit that she must have been foolish enough to think would convince him of her innocence in the matter. But they both knew that wasn't the case. Mr. Midoriya hasn't been a hero for a full 2 days yet, the hybrid genius said as he stared intently at the human in front of him. And you already sent out an internal memo for all top 10 ranked heroes to stay clear of him and warned half of the police departments in the country to be wary of him. No need to be dramatic. The president spoke, her tone detached from the situation as she stared at the educator with emotionless eyes. The man can return to his hero work as soon as he agrees to the commission's demands. I'm afraid that indentured servitude is a bit more than simple demands, Nedzu said, taking pleasure in the twitch of the woman's eyes when he said the word. Take from me that this particular request will fly over extremely poorly if it's made public. Are you threatening me? The woman sounded offended, enough to make Nedzu almost want to smile out of sheer spite. So you come to my office thinking I'm like one of your teachers. I assure you that my teachers, however disappointing their decisions may be, Nezu responded instantly, cutting the woman off. The venom in the president's words made him want to bare his fangs. Happened to learn from their mistakes. Denied, Nezu said, his voice harsh as he tore up the resignation letter in his hands, staring at the assembled heroes in his office. You think you can walk away after what you did? Try and make things better by running away from your responsibilities. It's not that, Eraser had said, his voice broken as he stared down at Nezu. The lack of sleep and mental exhaustion made the man look more like a corpse than a man. I have no right to teach the next generation of heroes, let alone the students I forced into this mess. No, you don't, Nezu responded, his words like a punch to the gut for the same people he once thought of as family. But you should have thought of that before you got the children involved. Now you have a year to fix what you broke, so I suggest you stop feeling sorry for yourself and start doing your job. If you're referring to Lady Nagant and Hawks, the woman said evenly as if trying to rein her anger with each word. My people are still working on the situation, and they will be apprehended relatively soon. If you think that is what I'm worried about, then you are more of a lost cause than I originally thought, Nezu said as he closed his eyes and let a deep sigh fill his lungs. Every known instance of the Commission trying to have a hero do its dirty work has led to misery for all involved, especially for the heroes under your thumb. Your point? My point is that Mr. Midoriya has already suffered enough due to the mistakes and failures of those he trusted. Nezu responded, his voice more like a growl with each word. Instead of trying to give that man an olive branch to make up for your past actions, you decided to double down. This organization and those in its employ have decided to return to what it started 6 years ago by smearing an innocent man. We don't know if he's innocent, the woman responded, but they both knew that was a lie. We simply couldn't find any evidence of his guilt. That's a fundamental difference. All for one admitted it, Nezu said, leaning forward on his chair, ignoring the woman's motion towards her silent panic button she kept under her desk. He admitted to it on live television. Dozens of lie-detecting quirks agreed that the man told no lies about Izuku Midoriya. And we both know it. Nezu thought of the emotionally broken form of the former #1 hero. The giant of a man screamed, his voice raw as he smashed his colossal fist against the red paste that was once the head of his former archenemy. As he met his end, the man's mocking laughter was enough for Nezu to want a shower whenever he remembered it, the words keeping him up at night 5 years later. Say it, All Might roared. His voice was as raw, and his anger was blinding as he stared down at the broken body of his defeated enemy. Admit that my boy is innocent. The huge bloody fist of All Might hung high in the air like a meat tenderizer preparing a cheap cut of beef. The war had been brief but violent, with the city of Tokyo entirely destroyed by the onslaught the two titans had unleashed. Izuku Midoriya, All Might shouted, ignoring the man's cruel smile and taunting laughter as he lifted his bloody and scarred face off the ground by the once pristine color of his black suit. I don't want to hear another word out of your mouth that's not about my boy. You all did such a wonderful job, the monster had said triumphantly through broken teeth and a shattered jaw as he stared unblinkingly at the #1 hero. I must thank your lovely associates for gift-wrapping me that boy. Nezu remembered he was in his office when he heard those words, trying desperately to spearhead the defense effort. His office became the unofficial headquarters of the heroes during the closest the world had come to a new world war. But despite the chaos around him, Nezu stared unblinkingly at the video stream in front of him, so transfixed by the image of the Dark Emperor's broken body that the whole world around him felt cloudy and out of focus. He couldn't help but be memorized by the screens in front of him, the same thing playing on every channel and from every possible angle. He doubted there wasn't a single person alive on this planet who hadn't seen the video clip at least once. Like I needed to have a mole inside of UA to further my plans, All for One said with a smile, his mouth like an open and jagged wound, spitting blood and venom with each word passing his lips. But when I heard that your student was the one being accused, well, it was an opportunity that was too good to pass up. The air stilled, like the atmosphere around the two was burning and sizzling. It felt harder to breathe, and even though Nezu was miles away, he could feel the tension causing the fur on the back of his neck to stand up. All Might stared down at the defeated form of his lifelong enemy, his face a mask of pure hatred and disgust. The image may have been scrubbed from the internet, but Nezu would never forget it for the rest of his life. That moment All Might was no longer the symbol of peace but death incarnate. You thought you could take my apprentice from me. The villain spoke, coughing up thick globs of blood between each word. Arrest him and throw away the key, and I wouldn't have a backup plan. I wouldn't have a second candidate for my apprenticeship. Ned's eyes widened at the thought of what an entire year in the lowest depths of Tartarus could do to a child. What being abandoned by those he called friends and allies would do to anyone. Nezu was aware of just what All for One did to prime and prepare Shigaraki to become the next symbol of evil. Just what was he planning to do to young Midoriya? This society is tearing itself apart, turning on one another after just a couple of threads get pulled. All for One laughed as if the past year had been nothing more than a joke to him. All your sacrifice, and all the blood you spilled, and what do you have to show for it? Nezu imagined what the faces of his staff and students must look like as they heard the words being spoken, as he fought the horror and bile from escaping his mouth, so tainted by the knowledge that they threw an innocent boy into the fires of hell. That boy wasn't mine, but he soon will be. All for One laughed once more, his once brilliant criminal mind deteriorating from the assured brain damage his injuries had granted him. And it's all your fault. The camera feed cut off at that moment. Still, all of Japan knew what had happened. The earthquakes that ripped through the country that day lasted for minutes, seemingly shifting the foundations of the world itself before they stopped. All that was left of the most feared villain the world had ever known was a pile of bloodied meat and powdered bone. All that was left of the symbol of peace that day was a broken husk of a man, one too injured and ashamed for what he allowed to happen to spend another moment as a hero. The only thing we know is that All for One had plans for Mr. Midoriya. The president spoke, her voice somewhat under control now as she looked towards the furry principal with a languid glance. What those plans are, we can't possibly know. You spent an entire year interrogating him for information and received nothing in return. Nezu rebutted, his tone showing he had grown tired of the drawn-out conversation. The only thing keeping him invested now was the anger and disdain for the woman in front of him. No evidence of his guilt and more evidence of his innocence mounted by the day. A confession that was beaten out of a man is not legally binding. The woman countered, her eyes shifting to the door leading to her office, waiting for one of the enormous personal bodyguards she kept on staff to barge in and end the verbal spar she was losing. All Might was lucky he wasn't charged for what he did. You mean stopping a madman who had operated under your noses for decades? Nezu responded, actually finding it funny in retrospect how few in the hero community looked towards All Might for wisdom when the truth of All for One came to light. As if the symbol of peace wasn't spending decades hunting down and eradicating the remnants of the villain's shadow empire for decades. How would the public have reacted to that? All Might almost single-handedly ending the war against the Paranormal Liberation Army and then gets arrested on live TV. Hero society almost crumples, and you make jokes, the president said again, her face showing she was pushing the button under her desk harder now. All Might was willing to throw away all he built, and for what? A boy he left to wallow in Tartarus for a year. Nezu bit back the primal desire to use his claws and fangs to rip and tear into the president's flesh, his intelligence winning out, if only barely. Even after so many years, Nezu still blamed himself for inadvertently setting up the environment for all this to happen. Things had changed after the capture of Shigaraki at the Camino raid. The knowledge that All for One was not only alive and had been pulling the strings of the League of Villains the whole time but was still out there dominated Nezu's thoughts. All Might agreed, knowing he would be the only one who stood a chance at defeating an almost fully healed All for One and had promised he would hunt down the villain for as long as it took. The days morphed into one another, with weeks morphing into months before anyone truly realized what had happened. Nezu knew the reports of his temporary replacement were hiding something. He should have looked further into it. Still, the search for All for One was too crucial for him to allow distractions. What a fool he had been. A year of hunting and searching, war and raids, and non-stop violence had led to nothing before All Might was forced to return to Japan. But, in their absence, the war had already been taken to their front door. You insult the man who saved the country in the same breath you try to justify your actions. Nezu responded, his opinions of not just the woman in front of him decreasing by the second, but his view of the species in general. You should learn to keep that mouth shut, or you will not like the outcome. Is that a threat? No, Nezu said simply, the mental image of All Might returning to this office and treating this woman the same way he treated her predecessor all those years ago. His own faculty would attest that there was nothing like seeing an enraged All Might to make you question your past life choices. It's a promise. Perhaps we can tone down the aggressive language, the president said as she leaned forward, trying and failing to use her size advantage to take control of the conversation. It would be a shame for UA to lose such a valued and experienced face in these troubling times. Nezu paused, reading between the lines of the woman's statement and not liking what he saw. He didn't want to do this, but this seemed to be the only way for him to remain on the offensive. All I need to do is make one phone call, Nezu said, his paw sticking one digit into the air as he spoke, and All Might will break his silence about everything he has so politely kept under wraps this whole time. The effect was instantaneous, the smugness leaving the woman's face when Nezu brought up the name of the symbol of peace. A character that was so prominent and respected that no one, not even the entirety of the Hero Commission with all its power and influence, could hope to silence. We both know you had been watching young Midoriya for some time before the allegations spread around. It was mandatory, as the governing body for all of Japan's hero schools after all, for the commission to have access to the video stream of UAS entrance exam. So you looked into that boy's past for anything you could use to bind him to you. We found credible evidence of the boy's less than honest nature, the woman said, leaning down on her desk. Your own faculty and student body agreed with us back then. We followed the proper guidelines. Is that what we are calling it now? Nezu said, cringing at the thought of Izuku Midoriya, the woman being forced to leave the country to avoid the harassment she was facing. The poor woman was willing to stand up to death threats in the army of stalking reporters looking for blood. Still, the moment her apartment had been firebombed was enough to convince the housewife to decide that Japan was no longer safe. I had no idea that what happened to Izuku Midoriya was considered the proper way to do things. That was an unfortunate mishandling of sensitive information. The president had the courtesy to look somewhat ashamed at the moment. Still, for Nezu, it wasn't enough. If I could go back in time, save it for someone who cares, the small principal said as he stood up from his chair to leave. I fear I've wasted my time in coming here. Nezu turned to walk away, not knowing the last time he had felt so much disgust for the concept of humanity. 5 or 6 years ago, if he had to guess. I'm sorry that you've had to come all the way down here. I'm sure you're a busy man after all. Nezu could hear the sarcasm in the woman's voice but chose not to lower himself to the party insults of his enemies. Rest assured, the Commission and I only have what's best for our heroes and Mr. Midoriya in mind. So you don't plan on making Izuku's return to Japan a public matter, Nezu said, savoring the woman's face dropping as he spoke. Did she really think he had no idea what they were planning? If you want to destroy whatever credibility you have left with the heroes of this country, be my guest. It will not go well for you when this is all over. I'm trying to protect our way of life, the president shouted, standing up from her seat as Nezu put his paw on the door handle. If you can't see that, then I doubt we were on the same side. If hero society was that close to being toppled over because of the truth, it deserved to be toppled over, Nezu said simply, his small black eyes looking more inhuman than they did a moment ago. I will not let you throw this man under the bus again to satisfy whatever greater good you are fighting for. He opened the door, allowing the president to see the members of her security detail she had not so secretly called during their meeting. The reason for their late arrival became apparent as they stood awkwardly in front of a young man who both Nezu and the president knew very well. The man was tall and muscular, his red cape recognizable as the flames of Endeavor or the bunny ears of Mirko. But for once, the trademark smile on the young man's face was absent. Instead, he stared challengingly at the men before him, almost daring any one of them to try and get past him. Lemillion, the number 2 hero in the country and the youngest man to ever hold the title, stared unblinkingly at the suited men. The president, now knowing who leaked her memo and that whatever she thought of how her meeting with Nezu had gone, the scolding she would receive from Mirio would be far worse. I must thank you again for keeping me in the loop, Mr. Tajito, Nezu said, smiling for the first time since entering this accursed building. Thank you for allowing me to speak with the Madam President first. I know it took a lot of restraint. Not a problem, sir, the number 2 hero said, his eyes traveling away from the eyes of the frankly justified, scared shitless security force to look into the eyes of the president. It gave me the time I needed to think of what I would say to her. Nezu watched the young man enter the room without another word. The door to the office slammed shut with enough force to shake the room's inhabitants to the floor and knock several paintings off the walls as he did so. Nezu said nothing as he left, stepping over the still frozen bodies of the president's bodyguards as he did so. He would like nothing more than to witness young Mirio tear into the woman, but he knew he did not yet have the time to do it. After all, he had many more calls to make before the day was done. Chapter 6, The Kids Are Not Alright. The following is a fan-based parody. I own nothing about this property. They are owned by their respective owners. Please support the official release. The day had been quite a long one for Izuku Midoriya. To be more accurate, though, the past 2 days of the young man's life could only be described as a time management clusterfuck. One where the hours ticked by like minutes and still felt like they would go on forever. Like a bit of a carnival-style roller coaster being operated by someone who was only semi-conscious because of illegal substances. 5 muggings, 2 convivance store stick-ups, 4 carjackings, 12 drunken brawls, a house fire, and an attempted kidnapping, and the human trafficking ring he busted had been the highlights. Still, they were far from the only incidents he got himself involved with. It seemed like Izuku found himself on the opposite side of the city every other hour, breaking criminal jaws or helping a civilian out of a bad situation. In the past 36 hours, Izuku had been up for most of them, only getting a few hours of sleep right before the sun rose on Sunday morning. Frankly, it was one of the busiest times in Izuku's life, and he wouldn't change it for anything. All he needed was a football riot full of hooligans, the most prominent of the United Kingdom organized villain groups, to break up. He would feel like he was back in either the London Underground or the streets of Glasgow. He was a hero, patrolling the streets he had spent his childhood in while defending those who couldn't protect themselves. Izuku could ignore his body's pain and exhaustion and skip yet another meal because he was finally doing what Izuku had wanted to since he was 3. So why did he feel so low? Why are you still here? A voice broke Izuku out of his thoughts, the aggravated voice putting a face to the reason Izuku felt the way that he felt. Don't you know where you're not wanted? Izuku Midoriya ran his hand through his hair, annoyance and aggravation filling his body as he took a deep breath. Half to control himself from doing something stupid and half from stopping himself from saying something he would regret. This was not the first time Izuku had found himself on the receiving end of the anger of a cop, and knowing him, it would not be the last. Don't worry, the young man said, his eyes not leaving the document in his hands as he answered. An action that certainly didn't put him in the good graces of the police officer behind him if the growl that left his lips was anything to go by. I was cleaning up before I left. The man said nothing, only looking at the young hero as he smugly took another puff of his cigarette. He was the detective initially assigned to the cold case investigation, and his years on the police force allowed the man to think he knew what he was doing. But, unfortunately, Izuku knew for a fact that the man was incompetent. Someone who barely kept his job for this long because he knew the right people, or more likely, knew who to kiss up to. The type of person who like to push people around just because they can get away with it. Why don't we stop pretending like we both don't know why you're here? A gruff and older voice said, forcing the light hanging over Izuku's head to shine directly into the young teenager's face. Tell us what we want to know and confess already. Izuku sat silently, straining his eyes to fight back the light shining on his face. If the prison guard wanted him to answer his questions, he was far from knowing what he was doing. Of course, you get more flies from honey than from vinegar, but the days of the Hero Commission promising that he would be released as soon as he told the truth had stopped long ago. Around the same time, Izuku realized they were looking at something other than the truth. He'd been here for about 6 months, or at least he figured it was 6 months. It was hard to tell the measure of time in his windowless cell. Whatever human interaction he could get amounted to, knowing it was a little under a week away from Christmas. He hoped his mother didn't spend it alone. Are you even listening to me? The guard spoke, his face red and eyes popping out of their sockets as he stepped closer to the prisoner. You think this is funny, boy? Izuku's eyes grew hard as he stared at the prison guard, the man's outer shell making him more than twice Izuku's size. Izuku and the Tartarus head guard did not get along. He wants to hurt you 9. The feeling was mutual. The lobster man had made these few months feel longer than they would typically have, almost taking pleasure in being an overall annoyance to the teenage inmate, withholding food and other privileges at the drop of a hat. It almost felt like he was back in middle school all over again. The man swung his giant crab claw down on the table, denting the table slightly right where Izuku's hands were a moment previously. A show of force than anything serious. Just a reminder for Izuku that he could, at any point, decide to get rough with him if Izuku stepped out of line. That was one difference between where he was in his old middle school. Back then, he had to deal with adults who hated him and turned a blind eye to the other children when they bullied him. Now, he was dealing with a grown man who didn't have to hide his dislike of Izuku with a fake smile and could legally assault him if the desire ever crossed his mind. It would be his funeral. You're lucky the Hero Commission doesn't want harm to come to you, boy, the guard said as he leaned down to sneer at the younger boy in his charge. But, of course, the commission was here. The only time he was ever allowed to leave the 10 by 10 foot cell he called home these days was when the commission came around. An action that had seemingly increased in number these past few weeks for whatever reason. The sudden opening of the reinforced door to the interrogation room cut off the tension between the ex-hero student and his current tormentor. The hiss of the vacuum seal of the armored door filled the room as an average-looking man, a prison guard on either side of him, walked into the room without saying a word. He was an average-looking man, someone with an average height and an average build with black hair slicked back in just the way to hide the fact that he was balding, but not enough to hide the fact that he was slicking his hair back because he was balding. He looked just like the tens of thousands of salary men Izuku had ever seen growing up. But for some reason, Izuku couldn't help but feel like he had seen the man somewhere before. It's the same guy as last time 9. Was it? It was getting harder and harder for Izuku to recognize the man. The man's quirk did wonders for him, and his ability to stay unnoticed. A minor hypnosis that made identifying himself nearly impossible, even with the sophisticated monitoring system keeping an eye on Izuku every hour of every day. The man was a walking, talking sense of déjà vu, one who only ever became noticed when he wanted to. Izuku remembered thinking the man's quirk was interesting before he realized why he was the man the commission sent to deal with him. I'm sorry that we have to be so rough with you, young man, the suited man said with a smile, but not one that filled Izuku with much confidence. But even you must admit, you don't need to keep up this act now. Surely you must see that. Izuku said nothing, didn't even react to the man's words at all. Why would he? It was the same thing every time the man came to talk to Izuku, to plead with Izuku and get him to tell them what he knew about the League of Villains or what All for One was planning. To spill his guts about all the information he had uncovered during his time as a mole. It didn't matter how long they asked. Izuku's answer would be the same thing. Mr. Midoriya, I understand better than most that we must do things we find distasteful to survive. The suited man spoke, removing his thick-rimmed glasses that made Izuku feel that much more familiar with the man than he did a moment ago. I know you wouldn't join the villains unless you had an excellent reason. Izuku still said nothing, but his eyes were no longer focused on the man in front of him. As the commission representative continued to speak, the guard, who had taken a step away from Izuku, had begun to circle around him. The large man slowly began to move. His bulk made it difficult to miss even if Izuku had been paying attention to the commission rep across the desk until he was directly behind Izuku's sitting form. But he still tried to make it stealthy, despite everyone in the room knowing full well what he would do. Be careful, 9. Izuku could hear the man's breathing increase. He almost felt the shift in the air as he raised his fist back to strike. It would be a shame if an accident were to befall you before you could confess to your knowledge. Izuku dodged the strike of the crab-claw armed officer behind him, catching the appendage in his powerful grip, the glow of his quirk almost blinding in the small room. Izuku overextended the pincer, cracking its outer shell as quickly as he would an egg until it was at its breaking point. Izuku ignored the voice in his head to break the man's arm, only staring defiantly at the now concerned-looking man in front of him. If this was some sort of trick, then Izuku was going to find out just what was. That's enough, Mr. Midoriya. A familiar sound of guns cocking filled Izuku's ears as he watched a slew of armed and armored guards rush into the room, their rifles leveled at Izuku's head. The voice, however, didn't come from any guards but from a woman who followed closely after them. Let the officer go, Midoriya, or I'm afraid I won't be able to help you. Izuku said nothing, ignoring the guns pointed at his head as he stared the older woman down. Her ash blonde looked different in person than it did in the newspapers. Still, Izuku could recognize the head of the Hero Public Safety Commission a mile away. The thought of fighting his way out of captivity arose within Izuku again. The voices in his head became louder, several distinct voices egging him on. But what then? Be a fugitive? Would that be an admittance of guilt? There's a great way of debuting to the public, becoming a wanted criminal. Besides, what would happen to his mother if he ran away? Would they go after her? Would she be put where he was now? He couldn't risk it. He just had to wait for All Might to come back. Then, he'd be able to fix this. Izuku let the crab officer go, ignoring the pain gasps. The man let go as he sat back down in his seat. An action that caused the armed Gors to lower their weapons, but not enough to make Izuku feel safe about that many people preparing to kill him if need be. Thank you for joining us, Madam President, the suited man said as he readjusted his glasses. He tried and failed to make it sound like the head of the Hero Commission visiting was a surprise and not something planned. I understand you are rather busy, but it would do us well to get this situation situated as quickly as possible. Izuku watched as the woman sat before him without missing a beat. The now two commission workers making Izuku feel more uncomfortable than having a man try to assault him. Oh, I must concur. The head of the HPSC sat down in front of Izuku, her smile bright and pleasant but fake. It's so good to meet with you, young man, finally. I've heard a lot about you. From All Might, especially. Izuku shook his head, internally deciding he had his share of these types of people for an entire lifetime before carefully replacing the evidence and documents into the box he took from when he arrived. In actuality, Izuku should be proud of himself and his accomplishment. It was the first murder investigation he had completed since returning, and solving a cold case an entire department had given up on was quite the feather in his cap. Of course, it would be even better if only the people he was working with weren't complete jerks about the whole ordeal, but Izuku was never one to look a gift horse in the mouth. While most heroes made their money arresting criminals who were caught in the act of a crime or saving and protecting civilians during accidents and natural disasters, a lot of them even made revenue on merchandise. Still, Izuku had learned from experience that investigating cold cases was a usually untapped source of income for any young hero, especially one like Izuku, who needed solid ties within the hero community after arriving back in his hometown just under a week ago and formally starting his professional hero career less than 48 hours ago. While it wasn't much, it did allow Izuku to stretch his investigative skills far more than just breaking bones and smashing faces permitted him. In retrospect, Izuku shouldn't have been so blunt regarding how simple it had been. After all, he doubted many cops took to being shown up by some 20-something-year-old who had only been on the job for less than 2 days. But honestly, fuck them. It wasn't Izuku's fault they were incompetent, and it certainly wasn't Izuku's fault that he knew what he was doing. It was his job, after all. The victim, a man whose face had been wrapped with bloodied bandages, was found in a long-since abandoned warehouse and had not been identified for almost 2 months. The sad fact was hundreds of murders went unsolved yearly, with thousands more just disappearing and never being seen again. If Izuku was honest with himself, he could see why. The victim's fingertips had been burned off, not by fire but by a particular acid that just about anyone could buy over the counter at most hardware stores. The victim had nothing in his pockets when he was found, no phone, wallet, or even anything to indicate who he was. But it was once the bandages had been cut off the victim's face that the investigation, for lack of a better term, hit a wall. The man's face, or what had been left of the man's face, showed little in the amount of identifying marks, to the point that even the specialist whose quirk allowed him to be momentarily revitalized destroyed organic material couldn't heal enough damage to make identification possible. It was less the work of a surgeon with a scalpel and more like a butcher with a cleaver. But whether the damage was done to the man's body before, during, or even after the murder was anyone's guess. Most of the department chucked any and all evidence regarding the case in a box marked as under investigation and spent the past few weeks passing it off to different investigators. Before, each one inevitably hit a wall and then gave up. The case had gone cold, and no one held much hope that they would ever be able to solve it. So the box containing the evidence was left forgotten in a broom closet to collect dust, the victim not even having a name. So, when Izuku arrived an hour ago, it came to the shock and even annoyance of many of those same officers when Izuku discovered the man's identity. Kenji Furuta, Izuku said confidently as he stared down the station chief, the small man's eyes going wide as the professional hero towered over him. He was reported missing out of Osaka around the time the body had been found. Height and weight match, so does the blood type. Izuku stood motionless in the center of the room, taking the attention of the detectives and senior officers as if he was a freak show up on display. He could sense thing was off the moment he walked into the station but couldn't understand the difference between how the station chief looked at him the night before and how the old man looked at him now. That could be anyone. someone had said, sounding almost offended at Izuku's theory. Izuku had seen this type of thing before, usually in smaller police precincts where many junior officers looked down on outsider help when solving a crime. He remembered a double homicide assailant almost getting away with in Budapest, all because his commanding officer was dragging his feet regarding listening to Izuku's evidence. Hundreds of thousands of men in Japan fit that description. It was true. A man with an average height, average weight, and the most common blood type were, by definition, common. But for Izuku, it had been the first step in identifying the victim. The missing person reports say that Kenji had a birthmark on the back of his neck, a distinct spiral-looking mark that fits your victim. The victim also shows scarring on his left leg, which indicates a recently healed femur. Kenji Furuta's medical records indicate he suffered an injury mountain biking last year. A broken left leg in the exact same place as your victim. The assembled group of senior detectives still needed to be convinced. Still, they kept quiet out of fear of being corrected in front of their superiors. Kenji Furuta also has a quirk that allows him to secrete acid, specifically acetone, from parts of his body. Impossible, the captain corrected. The way he spoke made Izuku feel they weren't on the same side as one another. The killer used the acid to destroy his fingerprints, making it harder to identify the body. Then why were there traces of acetone in the victim's shoes, and in his hair and in his nose? All places where Kenji's quirk allowed him to secrete acid. Izuku said with a shrug. Looking back on it all made Izuku realize that, for whatever reason, they had been trying and failing to poke holes in Izuku's theory. I checked with the coroner's report, and your victim's sweet glands are swimming with trace amounts of acetone. Like mine used to say, acid gets everywhere if you aren't careful. I looked into it further and found out that Kenji had a falling out with a business partner with a history of violent assaults that he managed to sweep under the rug. Izuku finished, ignoring the now dumbfounded looks from the detectives and officers as he held up another picture, a mugshot of a well-put-together man in a business suit. He was arrested 6 months ago after threatening to murder Kenji's fiancée with a butcher knife. He was caught on security footage in a convenience store less than a kilometer from where the body was found, less than an hour before it was found. Oh, that should have been it. The cold case was cracked, with the victim identified and a murder suspect named. Izuku was sure he could get the suspect to confess to his actions if he was allowed into the interview. But of course, not everyone wanted to have some rookie walk through the door and show them up at their own job. So, when the station chief denied Izuku's request to assist them in the arrest, Izuku wasn't surprised. He didn't get a handshake or a pat on the back. He didn't even get a thank you for his work. Instead, Izuku received glares and cold shoulders from those he walked past. Whatever dislike of him they had kept hidden was now being shown to the whole world. Before Izuku landed in Japan, he asked himself how long it would last. How long could he stay home before the glares and the whispers came back? Well, he got his answer. 2 days. You got lucky, the older man said, the disdain in his voice already getting on Izuku's nerves more than he would admit. The aesthetic of having a veteran cop giving the new hero on the scene a hard time had already gotten old for the young man. Just watch it, or you'll find yourself out the door with a boot up your ass. So that's how this was going to be. Izuku stood up from his seat, pushing back the chair without force to make the disgruntled police officer jump up. Instead, he sauntered to the older man, emphasizing every inch of Izuku's 6'6" frame and every ounce of his 235 pounds. Izuku had long since stopped caring about being nice to people who disliked him. He promised himself long ago that he would not turn the other cheek when someone threatened him, especially when he did nothing wrong. The police officer, who but a moment ago sneered and belittled Izuku as if he was nothing more than a criminal, took a step back. Then he took another and then another until his back leaned against the wall of the interrogation room, near the sole door to the room. Whatever confidence and attitude he once held were gone, as if the knowledge that a man nearly a foot taller than him and outweighed him by almost 100 pounds was coming towards him had short-circuited the police officer's mind. Maybe he was thinking of the Yakuza enforcer Izuku had knocked out with a single punch, still sitting in a holding cell after Izuku had dropped him off the night before. Maybe he was thinking about the car door Izuku had ripped off to shield himself from a villain's fire breath. Or maybe the cop was thinking about Izuku's gnarled and knotted knuckles smashing into his eye socket and nose repeatedly until the older man's face looked like it was made out of ground pork. It was almost like insulting a professional hero wasn't a bright idea, especially when the hero was already not in the best of moods. But instead of a punch to his jaw or a huge gloved hand around his neck, the officer watched silently as Izuku reached down to the door handle. It swung open with enough force to almost take it off its hinges as Izuku stared down at the older man with a smile on his face and a threat hanging in the air. "Would you do me a favor and get me a cup of coffee?" the younger man said, his smile shining brightly as he stared down at the face of his accompanying officer. "I've been up for hours already, and if I don't get some caffeine, I don't know what I'll do." Despite the friendly tone and smile, the veteran officer knew a threat when he heard one. He knew when push came to shove, the only reason he was able to walk out the door was that the hero in front of him allowed it to happen. He backed away through the now open door, his wide eyes making him look like a scared rabbit being allowed to leave the presence of a dire wolf. Izuku wouldn't hit first, but he would undoubtedly hit last. If the police officer in front of him wanted to play games with him and thought Izuku wouldn't retaliate, then Izuku would correct him and anyone dumb enough to try the same thing. He refused to be pushed around anymore. Izuku moved back to the desk, stuffing the rest of the evidence into the box with more force than before. At this point, he just wanted to leave and go home before he ended up putting someone through a table. He sighed as he reflexively rubbed the corner of his eyes, already somewhat regretting the decision to come back home. When he returned to Japan, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Sure, his name had been cleared of wrongdoing, and he was in the clear legally, but that didn't change matters when it came to everyday people, especially when they lacked trust in the institutions that cleared his name. Fuck him, Izuku muttered to himself as he exited the room. Whatever patience he had left after this weekend seemingly evaporated, as all the young man wanted to do now was to return to his office and end the night with cheap takeout. But like so many things in Izuku's life, he found himself face first with something he didn't want to deal with. Or someone. He must have been more tired than he thought if it took this long to notice the familiar figures in front of him, which should have been more of a reason for him to leave. But the old hero nerd instincts had yet to die entirely in Izuku. As the young man froze where he stood the second, he realized he was no longer the only man in the room with a hero costume. I was told Mr. Midoriya was here. The huge man spoke. His deep baritone voice was enough to gain the attention of every man and woman in the building, even if the large man wasn't completely covered in flames. Where is he? Izuku sighed, his shoulders slumping as he watched the mortified-looking station chief. The same man he had reported to earlier stuttered and flailed as he stared into the somewhat intimidating sight. The number 1 hero, Endeavor, and his son, the number 11 hero, Shoto, made an intimidating sight for those not expecting it. I'm sorry, Izuku, Shoto said, his voice never leaving its normal ice-like tone but somehow feeling colder to Izuku's ears than it did at the beginning of the school year. There were only 2 spots open regarding internships, and my father was insistent on Bakugo. There's nothing to apologize for, Izuku said with a smile. Sure, it stung that he wouldn't be in a work-study program with his friends, but it certainly wasn't something Shoto needed to be sorry about. I'll just be stuck at school for a couple of weeks, so it's no big deal. In actuality, Izuku felt somewhat relieved by the fact. After the death of Sir Night-Eye just a few months ago, Izuku had found himself hitting a bit of a rough patch. Despite what Mirio said, the Green Eat still blamed himself for not being quick enough to save the veteran hero. Maybe he still needed to be ready to throw himself into another hero's tutelage so soon. But with the man's death, All Might and Gran Torino leaving the country for an untold amount of time, Izuku found himself without any intern offer in what had become a very competitive market. So, you'll be under Aizawa-sensei's supervision, Shoto said, relief filling his eyes as he nodded to himself. So, you won't be alone. Pretty much, the Green Eat said with a smile, the buzzing of a headache returning full force as he turned away from his friend. He had been getting a lot of those these past few weeks. He should see Recovery Girl's temporary replacement for a checkup when he has the chance. Aizawa said Shinso and I are going to be working together a lot, so it shouldn't be too bad. His former friend looked good. He was taller and broader than he was the last time Izuku saw him, going through the same growth spurt Izuku himself had these past few years. But he was lean, at least compared to the heavyweight his father was, looking far more built for speed than pure power. His hair was cropped short, and the bangs he used to hide his scar from the world were gone. But, overall, he looked just what Izuku expected his former classmate to look like. He had even kept the design of his hero uniform consistent from their days in school. That flaming goatee was a nice touch, though. Despite everything that happened, he still followed the carriers of his old classmates. Call it a bad habit, when he hadn't fully kicked yet. Call it a sad cry for help or the same stalkerish behavior that turned so many against Izuku when he was younger. Whatever it was, Izuku knew it wasn't healthy and had long since decided to stop in order for him to move on from the mess his teenage years had been. But life, as they say, always finds a way. Neither of them noticed him, and for a moment, Izuku was thankful for his growth spurt. The fact that he ditched the emerald green of his UA hero suit for the darker shade he wore now probably helped too, but not as much as being a foot taller than he was in school. Whatever the reason was, they didn't recognize him, which was a bit of a godsend for Izuku. Izuku contemplated leaving before the police captain could answer the hero's question. Izuku didn't doubt he could lose them in a crowd. He had slipped away from worse odds when he worked undercover in Hong Kong in the Seoul Underground. It wouldn't even be the first time he escaped the notice of one of his former classmates. Besides, he was far too tired and annoyed to deal with whatever Endeavor wanted to say to him. So the least said about Shoto, the better. But before Izuku could move, he saw Shoto's eyes meet his own, the blue and red iris widening in shock and fear as recognition slowly filled them. Despite himself, Izuku found himself back 6 years in the past, staring down the son of the then number 2 hero and in front of a sold-out crowd and millions of televised onlookers at the UA Sports Festival. Back before everything went to shit. Well, Izuku said, steeling his features as he watched his former classmate take a tentative step toward him. Shoto looked to be battling himself on what to do and what to say, but Izuku couldn't even imagine what those words could be for his life. Here I am. Seeing how he now had no chance to leave unnoticed, Izuku took a step forward. He hoped to get whatever the 2 top heroes wanted over and done with so Izuku could grab a bite to eat and go home, but he didn't like his chances. He didn't expect to see Shoto flinch from Izuku's lackluster response, like Izuku's words were like a slap to his face. "Izuku," Shoto said, his voice almost as brassy and deep as his father now. "It's you." The two former classmates stared awkwardly at one another, different emotions mixing and twisting within each of their minds. "Yep," Izuku said, his lips popping the P and yep as he did, already too uncomfortable with how the situation was playing out. "It's me. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Deku Was Suspected Traitor. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout-out to who let this guy on for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on fanfiction.net for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to Deku Fanfic for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.